Hey everyone, and welcome to today's show. I'm going to review this debate that Lance had with Michael Huemer on Metaethics. Obviously, I've talked to Lance a bunch of times before. I did talk to Michael Huemer once before, and I think it was actually about Metaethics. It was about 3 or 4 years ago now, though, so I can't really remember. I haven't watched this debate yet, but to sort of, I guess, overall reveal my biases for anyone who doesn't know me, I sort of prefer Lance's view and approach to philosophy overall, and so we'll have like a bias in that direction, I guess. But I've got Lance here as well to sort of commentate over it and his experiences. So obviously, go and subscribe to Lance's channel, and also I think the guy whose channel this was hosted on, called Curiosity. I think if people are interested, seems to be doing a lot of these sorts of debates and things. Yeah, come in if you want, Lance.
Yeah, Curiosity Guy. You could find him like at Curiosity Guy.
Yeah, I hadn't actually seen his channel before, so this was kind of the first time that I came across that. So is there anything you want to say about this debate discussion, how you felt it went before we get into it, or do you want to just go into it and see what
I want to see your reaction without influencing you in advance. So
okay.
I'm mostly interested in your reaction to it without my biases or commentary, but it's hard for me to resist jumping in and commentating, so I guess I'll do that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Other than that,
and then I will say obviously on the thumbnail as well, I put, pure rhetoric with Michael here. And I've taken that from what someone said in the Discord about this, not because I have an informed view and because clickbait is the way to generate engagement. So if you're a Michael Huemer fan or Michael Huemer watching this, my apologies, but that's the way that it's got to go. So without further ado, then let me open this up and get into it. And I'll probably play it on a little bit faster than whatever it initially was, and hopefully that'll be all right.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Curiosity. Today is a special day for the channel for two reasons. The first reason, and the small reason you can say, is that our channel has crossed 1,000 subscribers after 7 years, so that's a big achievement in my view. So that's the first reason, and the second reason is a more special reason. What BA from UC.
I'll skip through this start bit a little bit to just get to the actual debate.
Berkeley, and his PhD.
The standard uncontroversial examples of non-false, and they don't depend on the attitudes of. Why do I think that they're not all false?
So yeah, we have both our interlocutors here waiting. So with
guy. Okay, so I guess I'm going to sort of summarize what I said in my book. So my book, Ethical Intuitionism, that everyone should buy. All right, so are there objective moral facts? That's our question. And first, I'll say something about what that means. What does it mean that there are objective moral facts? Objective means something like independent of the attitudes of observers towards the objects of evaluation. Okay, so if something is objectively good, that means it's good, and whether it's good doesn't depend upon how people feel about it or what people believe about it or something like that. Okay.
Yeah, so I want to say something about this. I think this is one of those distinct, and obviously you've done a ton of stuff sort of writing about this and unpacking it, right? But I mean, this is one of those distinctions in philosophy that I think everyone sort of comes across as they begin to explore the subject, sort of subjective, objective distinction. Even if you're not into mainstream academic philosophy law, you're probably going to come across this through popularizers like, I don't know, Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson or someone, right? And I do think that it's actually very complicated to get at what is being got at, because, there's all sorts of problems of us sort of being trapped in our own world epistemically or trapped in language. What does it mean for something to mean something from nobody's perspective, from you get these classic metaphysical issues or whatever that people might induct people into this through, if a tree falls and nobody's around to hear it fall, does it make a noise or whatever? But I think that the more I've personally thought about this, the less and less I've really understood what objective means. So I tend to think of objective to mean that people are just really, really, really certain of what they're saying. Now, I don't personally, that doesn't mean that I'm some metaphysical idealist or something like that. I do think that there's a world and stuff, but just the idea of sort of English sentences being the case from the perspective of nobody, I find very, very curious and weird, and I think it gets too much of a free pass. I much prefer the idea of sort of like intersubjectivity. I think it's more actionable and more helpful and more sort of realistic to the way that our practices of kind of figuring things out work. I think that objective sort of it gets too much of a free pass because it's like too certain and too kind of rigid. But I don't know, maybe I'm jumping the gun on sort of coming in on that too soon.
Yeah, well, Huemer is careful in his usage, as are philosophers that have been addressing this topic over the past 30 or so years. I mean, I certainly have criticisms of the importation of words and phrases that are extremely polysemous, like they have lots of different meanings, are prone to being used in ambiguous ways, and that carry a lot of pragmatic features and connotations in their ordinary usage. To take that terminology, a term like objective, bring it into philosophy, and then use it as a technical term, where the intention is to use it in a way that strips away those pragmatic features, that strips away those other colloquial uses as I'm sorry, uses and associations, and then uses it in a very distinct technical way. This would be weird in the sciences. Like, imagine if instead of calling elements like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, like we called them various sort of terms that already existed in folk language, that would be really confusing. Like, we call them mitochondria for a reason. We don't call them like, some like toasters. Like, that'd be really weird because like toasters use energy or something. It confused the hell out of people in a lot of contexts to start using language that has all these associations in a technical context. So philosophers could have, if they really wanted to be clear about things, come up with their own terms, and sometimes they do. If I run up to someone and I say, "Hey, is morality objective?" they might think that they know what I'm asking them. But if I ask them, "Hey, do you think that there are irreducibly normative stance-independent facts about about deontic sentences, or like such as murder is wrong or something like that, or you should not murder?" They're not going to know what the hell I'm talking about because I'm using too much technical terminology there. So I don't know why philosophers do this. But as far as the folk view of objective, like, it's used to be like unbiased, measurable. It sometimes expresses some type of certainty. It's sometimes used to mean like absolute or without exceptions. It has so many uses, and some of those even overlap with certain philosophical uses. And the worst part is philosophers themselves have not even been consistent with this terminology. They use objective in different ways too.
I think one of the reasons I find it a little bit weird and suspicious, like maybe the kind of like initial way that people mean it, is, and this is a point that I've seen you raise in discussions about metaethics too, is that I'm never really clear. I'll say I don't know what you mean by that, and they'll say, look, if nobody was around, would like proposition be true or something? And then there's like a number of things they might be asking me there. Are they asking me relative to my context of evaluation now, imagining nobody around, do I think some sentence is true? Well, yes, but then that's not the same as nobody being around. That's me evaluating it in my context. And then there's like relative to the context of evaluation where nobody's around, is some sentence true? It's like, well, then there's nobody for words to mean things and for sentences to evaluate. And so I'm not exactly sure what I'm even supposed to be imagining, because if I'm imagining it, then I'm sort of putting a person and an evaluator in that. So I find that like there's just so much weirdness and nuance in this concept of objectivity that I have a hard time kind of buying it from the get-go personally. But obviously, people are probably thinking like, look, you've hardly let him even introduce his point, so I'll let it play, and he can do that.
Okay, so I think there are objective moral facts. So what are the alternatives? Okay, so if there aren't any objective moral facts, then it could be that all moral statements are false. Or if they're true, it could be that their truth depends upon the attitudes of observers towards the things being evaluated. Or it could be that they're neither true nor false. And so I just want to say, I don't think any of those things are the case. Right? So if none of those is the case, then there are moral truths and they don't depend upon observers, so there are objective moral truths. Okay, so all right, so why do I think that they're not all false? Well, for example, I think you shouldn't torture babies for fun. If you have a baby, you shouldn't torture it just for fun of it, right? And that's partly because I think
So I know that this is the one thing someone could say to trigger you the most in the world. And I think I agree with you about this as well, that it's not an entailment of any of these meta-ethical views, like what your first order ethical view should be, right? So you could obviously believe that or not believe that, and what we're trying to do is provide an account of what's really going on when people use ethical discourse, right? But well, it depends. There's some nuance. There are some views where you could sort of like, infer maybe a little bit more about people's first order views. But in general, like bog standard sort of like realism and bog standard sort of anti-realism are sort of leaving ethical discourse in place and saying, how do we account for what's really going on here metaphysically, right? And so that entitles people to any point of view on the first order claim. And so it is a bit of a kind of bait and switch to say like, well, I just buy, the plausible view that murdering babies is wrong. Like, do you deny that? And I find it very frustrating when people make this move. Like, I find it particularly disappointing coming from, someone who I take to be doing more sophisticated philosophy than sort of like, kind of bog standard Christian apologetics, right? Because this is a kind of point that Christian apologists will often make in a very uncritical, unthoughtful way, and it frustrates me. Anything you want to say on that, Lance? Feel free, or not? No, you good? Cool.
Pain is bad. I think you shouldn't cause bad things for trivial reasons. Okay, but just the fact you shouldn't torture children for the fun of it is just about the most obvious premise that you could find in a philosophical argument. And in the history of philosophy, philosophers have put forward a lot of theories and a lot of premises to argue for their theories, and it's pretty hard to find a premise that's more obvious or less controversial than that one. Okay, so it seems like that should be fair. That should be a fair starting point. Don't torture children for fun. Okay, so
I can hear you there as well. It seems to who?
Yeah. It seems that that's a fair starting point. A starting point for like, what does he mean when he says like it's this? We could start with, yeah, it's wrong to torture babies for fun. We could start with a normative claim. Why are we starting with a normative claim? Oh, is this not a normative claim? If it's not a normative claim, then what kind of claim is it? And if it's not a normative claim, why are you using a normative claim to convey the non-normative content? Like, why use an example like that to convey some metaphysical or conceptual notion that isn't disambiguated and clearly expressed by the normative claim? I don't understand what would be the incentive to structure things this way if one's intention was to be clear to any sort of audience, maybe some philosophical audience, but to a non-philosophical audience, there's a very clear implication here. And this is something that Joyce talks about in the SEP entry, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on anti-realism, where he talks about how you really have to be careful about what you're saying in a philosophical context versus what you're saying in some ordinary context. In a philosophical context, if an error theorist is at a conference and someone says to the error theorist, oh, you're an error theorist? Yes. Oh, okay. So you would affirm that the statement, it's morally wrong to torture babies for fun, is false, right? And they'd be like, yeah, of course, because I'm an error theorist. Okay, great. I've established what your position is. Imagine you run into a person on the street and for whatever reason, the conversation comes up and you end up asking them, wait, you do think it's wrong to torture babies just for fun, right? And they're like, no. But that person, that they're not just saying something about their meta-ethical view in that context. That person would be interpreted by almost everybody as expressing a normative view and saying something about their character and attitude. And I think that almost all of what's motivating hostility and opposition towards error theory, subjectivism, and non-cognitivism relies on this almost like Necker-Q vacillation between what that statement would mean in the technical context and the philosophical context, where the error theorist is saying, basically what the error theorist is doing is responding to a special instance that's representative of their overall view, which is when people make moral claims, they're trying to describe they're making these certain metaphysical claims. Those metaphysical claims are false. Therefore, the claim is technically false. And it just says nothing about their conduct or their attitudes or their behavior or their normative stance or anything like that. It's just a very technical thing. People mean this, they get the metaphysics wrong. But in that ordinary context, the person is like that person on the street. You'd be worried about that. You're not going to leave your children with that person. Whereas with an error theorist, if they say, yep, it's not morally wrong to eat children alive, That person is not there. Nothing about that technically carries any implication that person is going to be like likely to eat children or not care if somebody does. And so why play with the two? Why play with the two when you yourself, as the critic of the error theorist, could actively cancel out that implication? You could say, look, the error theorist thinks the statement it's morally wrong to torture babies for fun is technically false. But of course, the error theorist is not against, they're not in favor of baby torture. They're not ambivalent. You know, every error theorist I know is against baby torture. They oppose it just as much. You could cancel out the implication if you wanted to. But I almost never see moral realists actually do this. Why? Why don't they do it?
So to give some praise, my co-host of Bad Apologetics, James, the other day, he did a video on a discussion between Michael Huemer and Sean McDowell on metaethics. And so James is a realist, but similarly, I think he got frustrated at this point being made by McDowell, and made the point that you've just made as well about how no one is sort of regardless of which position you take in the metaethical debate, no one's like denying these first order claims, right? So so there are at least some realists out there who don't do this, but typically what I do see is, rather, I think it's for people who are kind of looking for these knockdown arguments against the views rather than like, theory comparison type approaches. They find that there is like some crazy entailment or something that to them is obviously wrong, and that tends to just be mistaken or a misinterpretation of what the other side is claiming or takes themselves to be doing. But yeah, it's very frustrating because it's just straightforwardly not true. Like, you've just got to say, Lance, do you think torturing babies is wrong? No. So I must have misunderstood something about your view if I'm claiming that that's something that you believe, right?
So that's not false. All right, so we should reject, the first alternative, that all moral statements are false. Okay, second alternative, maybe the moral statements, maybe sometimes they're true, but their truth depends on the attitudes of observers. Well, no, that just doesn't seem to be true. So if you like torturing babies for fun, then is it okay to do it? No, it seems like it's obviously still wrong. What if you have a sentiment of moral approval towards baby torture? Then should you do it? No, you still shouldn't do it. It still seems like it's wrong. What if you believe that it's okay to torture children for fun? Right? Then is it okay to do it? No, still seems like you shouldn't do it. Okay, what if your society approves of it? What if there are different conventions and there's a society in which the convention is, you torture babies for fun? No, still seems wrong and bad. Okay, so it seems like it doesn't depend on the attitudes of observers towards the thing being evaluated. In this case, the object of evaluation is baby torture. Okay, so moral statements, they're not all false, and they don't depend on the attitudes of observers. The other alternative is maybe they're neither true nor false. This is referred to as non-cognitivism. So the non-cognitivists think they're neither true nor false because they don't really assert propositions. Meaning, when you say that something is wrong, you're not actually describing any alleged state of affairs. You're not even asserting that the world is any particular way. And you're doing some other kind of speech act, like you're expressing your feelings, or you're trying to influence other people's behavior, but you're not trying to describe any fact about the world or about yourself or about anything. Okay, so all right, and so then that
I think an interesting question for sort of like the series of cases that Huemer just went through for him would be like, and now sort of imagine yourself in a world where torturing babies for fun is stance independently right. Do you still think it's wrong? Like, and I think he would probably say yes, because I don't know, like maybe he wouldn't, but my guess would be, he'd still just be basically imagining himself in a world, and he would just have the same kind of background beliefs and framework, because that's what he seems to be doing in each of the cases that he's taken himself to imagine, to me, is sort of just saying, look, given I think this, and then I vary something about the world, do I then say that it's wrong? No, I'm still going to say that that's wrong, right? But I think that would just be the same in the case of his sort of, the entities in his theory that apparently make it true, make his statement true. If you sort of varied them as well, I think he'd still imagine himself as saying it's wrong. So I think that would maybe undermine his case here. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know what specifically Huemer would say. I have asked other realists, what would you do, or what would you think? What kind of action or attitude would you have if there were reliable, like according to your own view, not like there was reliable information externally to you, like from your own judgment, you came to recognize that the stance independent moral facts were, sometimes I give people like really arbitrary and silly things like scream at tables all day. And other times it's stuff like you have a stance independent moral duty to like commit genocide all day or torture everyone until the end of time. What would you think? What would you do? One of the reactions I've got is that's impossible. Like it's not that it, because the moral facts are necessarily true, it's necessarily true that you ought not do that, which is weird because like, okay, but what about epistemic possibility? Isn't it epistemically possible that you are mistaken? If they want to say no to that, then now we've got a very strong moral epistemology that they have, because not only on that view would there be stance independent moral facts, but that one would have some kind of like infallible access to them. They would be self-evident. You couldn't be wrong about them. So there's a, it's one thing to say they're necessary. It's another to say they're necessary and I know what they are, and it's not possible for me to be wrong about it. It's actually not conceivable that the stance independent moral facts could have a different normative content than I think that they have. That's one reaction that I've had. I can't really recall any other reactions. A lot of times, basically, there are objections to the very framing of the question itself.
Yeah, it's kind of odd to me because I struggle to take someone as being completely honest if they said they couldn't imagine that, because like my values about deeply held commitments have changed, so I find it quite easy to imagine myself having very different commitments. Or like I think like I can imagine myself as what I would consider to be a very evil person who thought that like certain kinds of murder were right or something like that. Like I can imagine myself in that position, and so I think I can. So assuming then that I thought that my views were stance independently true, which is basically, for me, all my beliefs are kind of like flat or transparent in the sense that the entities that I think are, beliefs I have where I think they're objectively, so to speak, true, are the same as ones that I think are like subjectively true in the sense that they're like just beliefs that I have or something. And so when I imagine myself like that, I can imagine myself sort of simultaneously believing that my views sort of bootstrap into the necessary metaphysics of the world as well. So I can very easily imagine a case where those things would be different. So I don't know, maybe other people just have very, very different sort of like set of apparatus or background beliefs when it comes to trying to conceptualize things. But I think that is conceivable, or I don't know.
Yeah, do keep in mind, I'm not saying anything about how Mike Huemer would handle that response. I'm talking because I didn't ask him about this, but I share your attitude. I don't have a huge problem conceptualizing having radically different normative moral standards than I currently have. And this is one thing I've wondered about realists, is that there's it's not like realists say it seems to me, because like if it seems to me that there's a tree over yonder, and someone goes, yeah, that's not actually a tree, that's a this or a that. It'd be pretty easy for me to go, like if the evidence were good, to go, oh, okay, my bad. But the reaction that realists have is like, it's just so obvious. I
can't even imagine
idea that they could be wrong is like, it's ludicrous. They could be wrong. It's just so obvious. But like, they can't imagine a counterfactual where they were raised in a different culture, where they have the same seemings capacity, but it seems obvious that torture is okay, or killing members of the outgroup is okay, or whatever, like slavery is okay. Like there's all these things that they could think. They can't put themselves in the mindset to get a sense that they would just see that it's obviously okay. How do they not have that ability? And if they do have that ability and they can occupy that vantage point, I would wonder why they're not way more reserved about what the content of the moral facts are. But maybe I'm not giving enough credit to realists in that regard, because one thing you'll notice about non-naturalist moral realists is that at least many of them are hesitant to populate the body of the like really obvious or established stance independent moral facts with anything more than stuff like, indiscriminate slaughter for no real reason other than personal sadistic delight. That's wrong. But you don't see a lot of them say stuff like abortion after the first trimester. That's obviously stance independently wrong. Or, other more nuanced or complicated cases. So even if there are these stance independent moral facts in their view, it looks like they have very limited purchase on actually being applied to specific cases outside anything other than things that they regard as relatively uncontroversial. One last note I'll make about that, though, is that I think that even that would vary if we were in the context of a, like, let's say we, like, I don't know, aliens show up and we're in this like intergalactic federation where there's radically different perspectives, or if the world had not been so homogenized, our world of Earth. It's weird. I had to clarify that I'm in Earth. Like here on Earth, there's cultures today are not as different as they could have been counterfactually. It could be that with less globalization, less missionaries mucking things up everywhere, that there would be very different cultures with very, very different attitudes. And if they were all on the global stage, I can imagine realists dialing back the content even more of like what they consider the obvious or self-evident facts are. It looks to me like they're only willing to stick their necks out on things where they don't expect anybody to really contradict them on the normative facts. So there's something I find personally a little suspicious about that.
I think what is additionally suspicious for me is really going to be those like historic cases. So you don't even have to kind of like get into possible world semantics and all that stuff. You can just like look at history and see that there are many examples of people who actually seem to be, you know, have realist takes on things on theistic grounds, and simultaneously think it's all right to sort of like burn people and things for disagreeing with them. To see that people can be very, very like confidently mistaken, but with the exact same sort of like framework, right, for trying to figure out what the objective moral facts are and so forth. But yeah, I'll let it play a bit.
That would make them neither true nor false. So then like torture is wrong is something like boo on torture. Okay. So boo on torture is just an expression of your negative feelings about it. It's not either true or false. Okay. So the main problem with this is known as the Frege-Geach problem. So this theory could explain what it means when you just make a straight out ordinary moral assertion. You know, when you say X is wrong, they can explain that means you're expressing a negative emotion about X, right? Or you're trying to influence other people to not do X or something like that. But they can't explain what it means when X is wrong appears in a larger sentence, it appears embedded in a larger sentence where it's not actually being asserted. All right, so if I say, if doing something is wrong, then getting your little brother to do it is also wrong. Okay, which seems like a correct judgment. What could they say that means? So if the word wrong is used to express a negative emotion, what am I expressing a negative emotion towards when I say that? If doing something is wrong, am I expressing a negative emotion towards doing something? Like, no, right? I haven't even said what it is that might be wrong. And I didn't even assert that anything was wrong. I just said, if doing something was wrong, if there was something that doing it was wrong, then you also shouldn't get your little brother to do it. So I haven't expressed a negative feeling towards anything, right? And you know, you couldn't have a negative emotion towards just doing something in general. All right, so they have a hard time explaining that. And it's not just that particular sentence.
I find something so weird about the Frege-Geach problem as like, you know, this supposedly super strong case in metaethics. And I think it's that it's like a very sort of abstract, weird problem, so to speak. And so the idea that someone would have a hard time accounting for it doesn't really do anything to kind of like, you know, move me at all. Because I'm like, this just seems like a really bizarre, concocted problem that no one seems to be having with language. I know, like, I know you can sort of like make it work, but I guess I just don't really find it to be a consideration that's that important for my thinking about these things. And I think that there are ways of looking at the way that the relative terms involved are used by people, such that you could, you know, have a metaphysical account of what goes on when people use those words that's not truth evaluative, but still connects to the discourse of using the words true and false in English language as well, right? And so I just don't think that there is overall here like a real problem that kind of can't be solved in multiple ways. But and then you just have to ask, well, which is the better account overall, right, for how you solve that?
Right. I wanted to say something about this that I didn't say in the debate. So I end up saying, look, this does strike me as a problem for non-cognitivists, and I think some people weren't very satisfied with that because, you know, typically I'll defend anti-realist views, and then I kind of threw non-cognitivism to the wolves here. Now, that I think was, and you'll see that I do that. I think that was a sort of tactical error on my part. You know, I think one should concede ground where one has legitimately lost that ground. Now, it's weird for me to be defending views that I don't even endorse, but non-cognitivists do have resources at their disposal in principle. But I say in principle because what I'm addressing here, what I end up conceding here, is only a type of non-cognitivism that is committed to the highly rigid semantic accounts of traditional analytic philosophy, where they're all committed to what Michael Gill calls this uniformity and determinacy assumption. If the non-cognitivist is like, look, moral claims as a category on analytic grounds only and in every instance always express only non-propositional content, that's going to run into the problem that it does. You could find instances where people are embedding moral claims in ways that don't seem to fit with that usage. You could find that empirically. If we went out, we could find people doing that. And so then what do we say? Okay, well, those are like, what? How do we account for those? So the non-cognitivists could say, yeah, those are like a few weird aberrant cases. They're not actually that common. And we get to do a little bit of cleaning up. What are those, like performance errors? Are they mistakes? Are they metaphorical? On my view of what people are doing in these contexts, they may or may not be best described as making propositional claims in some of those contexts. And if you want to be this sort of like strict, pure non-cognitivist, that's going to be a problem. But I'm not actually sure non-cognitivists need to take such a view. And one thing that's worth noting is the strategy that Huemer and analytic philosophers typically employ, which is, this goes back to what is it that we're even analyzing when we're analyzing moral claims? What moral claims? Well, when I think about moral claims, I'm thinking about the actual utterances that occur in everyday life, things people post on Twitter and Facebook, things people say. They're instances of behavior. You could actually point to them. Kind of like if we were studying violent acts, we would be studying like an actual instance of an actual person punching another person. We wouldn't be talking about violent acts in the abstract. And yet, when analytic philosophers approach these cases, they're not describing any actual instances of language. They're describing hypothetical or imagined instances of language. And then they're analyzing what those imagined sentences mean. So, like, how often, for instance, do ordinary people in their everyday lives construct syllogisms and present them to one another? You're not seeing people on the street going like, if it rains, I will bring my umbrella. It rains, therefore I'll bring my umbrella. No one says shit like that other than philosophers. Like, very rarely. Like, I can't say no human being other than a philosopher has ever uttered a syllogism in a colloquial context. They might sometimes do it, but maybe the non-cognitivist could make a case here that type of language actually is parasitic on its standard usage. The thing is, that would take taking a view of language where you're treating meaning as use. You take meaning to be something that emerges in context of usage, and that allows it to be limbered up and to vary in accord with the context of usage that people are deploying it in, where you're not taking the sentences to have some sort of meaning independent of usage. Now, you can imagine, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, what if we went out, we did an empirical study, they put microphones on people or they have people carry around recorders, and we operationalized what we meant by a moral claim in some way that realists and anti-realists could agree, yeah, okay, we're going to count these as the moral claims, and these aren't going to be counted as the moral claims. If you're actually trying to do an empirical study, you have to operationalize. And is it going to perfectly capture on reflection everything we'd want to count? No. But as long as it approximates it well enough, let's say it captures 99% of the cases. Okay, so we have everybody wear these recorders, and we have them all over the United States. We get some representative sample of 1,000 people or something. We have them use it. They use it for a week. We come back and we tally it up. We have all the realists and anti-realists work together to tally it up. And it turns out 97% of the time, our best analysis of what people are doing when they make moral claims is that they're issuing imperatives or they're expressing emotions without any propositional content. And then 3% of the time, they're making propositional claims. At that point, all the armchair stuff about Frege-Geach and syllogisms and embedding, what do we do with that? Because now it does look like, as a matter of empirical fact, most of the time when people say things like murder is wrong, they're saying boo murder or don't murder. So if the empirical facts turned out that way, what are analytic philosophers going to do? I mean, one thing they could say is, yep, we were making empirical claims all along. Looks like non-cognitivism is true. And even if you can embed them in some contexts, so what? Those aren't their actual ordinary context of usage. Most of the time when people make moral claims, they're issuing imperatives expressing motion, not constructing syllogisms. So the cognitivists lose, non-cognitivism wins. Alternatively, what are they going to say? Well, because as an analytic matter, we did all these armchair tests, moral claims just are propositional. If that's not what they're doing, then they're not making moral claims. So like 97% of the time when people say murder is wrong or don't get an abortion or abortion is morally wrong or whatever, those actually aren't moral claims. Those people don't know what they're talking about. They're all confused. Or are they going to say, actually, those sentences actually are propositions independent of how the speakers were using them. So it doesn't matter what the people were trying to do. They actually have a meaning independent of their usage. I mean, none of these options would be appealing, I think, for the cognitivist. I was about to say the non-cognitivist, which is, I guess, technically what they would be. So like, it looks to me, and I thought about calling this the empiricist dilemma. If it is an empirical case, go do the empirical test. You could turn out to be wrong. The armchair analysis isn't going to work. If you insist it's not an empirical question, but the empirical data turns out against you, you're going to run into a different set of problems. And it looks like, so the empirical data looks like it creates problems for non-empiricist approaches to these questions either way. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a better articulation of some of the stuff that I was trying to get at, right? And I think the main part of that was in my line of thinking was that sort of amongst the claims that you have to accept to get this Frege-Geach problem off the ground is a certain sort of set of metaphysical claims about, what assoteric sentences mean and what truth aptness means. And that's in conjunction with the other parts that make up the Frege-Geach problem, right? Such that for someone to reject the Frege-Geach problem, they might just view, they might, instead of rejecting one of the kind of key premises in the argument, they might just reject this kind of like background assumption about what it is for a sentence to be truth apt, like either like the theory of truth or the theory of propositional content or whatever that's involved, right? And then there sort of is no problem. You've just got a more sophisticated account of truth, or what it means, what the mapping is in language between these sentences philosophers called assoteric or whatever. You've just got a way of making it work in both cases, such that the Frege-Geach problem isn't a legitimate problem, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, what if the folk notion of truth was deflationary or pragmatic? I mean, now how is that going to play with cognitivism? So, like, propositional claims are true or false in what sense? Correspondence sense? Because if the ordinary people aren't correspondence theorists, then how could they themselves be described as taking their positions to be true or false in the correspondence sense? They couldn't be. So when did philosophers establish that non-philosophers are correspondence theorists? Or does that not matter? And it could be any account of truth. I don't think that's going to fly. So, one thing to keep in mind is that philosophers doing armchair analysis of what people mean by some particular sentence, often, like if they're just describing a sentence and they're trying to give them metaethical analysis, okay, but if they're dropping in terms like true or knows or believes, they're invoking other notions that potentially have folk associations that they are helping themselves to assumptions about that could also be wrong. And if they are wrong about those assumptions, then what they're saying in this particular context might not make any sense or might not be true. And they don't. It looks like philosophers don't even seem to consider this.
So plausibly, there might be no candidates that are like this. But I was thinking, for a person who isn't seeing this point, like imagine some artifact of language that you would account for under like a boo-hurrah theory. So maybe, you'd think of someone saying the statement, I bloody love ice cream or something, right, along those lines, right? And then, you could say, imagine they also commit themselves to the claim, ice cream is the best, is true, right? Well, then, if that's right, though, then I would be putting non-truth apt statements in, these conditionals, and I couldn't reason about them in this way. So we've got the Frege-Geach problem, but then you'd be like, well, hang on, something's gone wrong here, because it makes sense that that language is being used in that way. And so what is it about this kind of conjunction of claims that I think is wrong? Now, obviously, someone could say, no, that kind of counter argument doesn't work for me because I don't think there are any examples of language that are like that. But I think you can be I don't know if there are any examples of language that I think are accounted for by like a boo-hurrah theory. But I can sort of just imagine myself taking that account of language and seeing it that way and resolving the tension in some way other than going, oh yeah, you've got me, my like theory's completely wrong, right?
Yeah. So are you imagining cases like in like gastronomic context, the person says something like, this cake is delicious, like, and you ask them what they're doing, they're like, yeah, I'm emoting, I'm expressing. And then you're like, but we could embed this cake is delicious in a syllogism, so you can't be doing that. You're wrong about that. Like,
yeah, or they take a different claim, like, so would you say cake is the best food or something? Or like, would you say like, cake is really good or something, and then you're like, yeah, I couldn't embed that now in like a conditional statement because it's not, I can't evaluate it as truth apt because you really mean this yay cake thing. Yeah. Okay. I'll play.
Any sentence in the English language that enables you to embed an assertion in a larger context. So there are many different constructions where you take a proposition, then you say something else involving that proposition as a smaller part of it. Okay, so it's true that P, like that's a normal construction in English where you have to put a proposition in for P. Or I wonder whether P, and then you have to put a proposition in for P. Okay, so any context in English where you have to insert a proposition, it's okay to put a moral statement.
You're muted.
I was like, good, because I laughed and I didn't mean to laugh. That was just my reaction. But it was basically based off the fact that there were these two sentence constructions. It's true that P, or, is it the case that P, or whatever it was that he said. And then he said, so for any moral statement, just off of these two cases that he imagined where he abstracted a proposition to P. He just said, so for any statement, this is true. It's like, whoa, hang on there. Hang on. That is not carefully looking at, all the cases of language that people use. And I think that that's just the kind of sort of like inductive generalization that philosophers engage in with the types of abstractions and models that they create that is prone to, error because language is just so complicated. There's so many different ways people use it.
Do they even take it to be an inductive inference, or is it just, well, because we're making these analytic claims, we only need to look at one case. We're not at a bunch of cases making an inference.
That's true.
They're all like this because moral claims like moral claims is a category. Like that category is a set, and a set has a shared set of metanormative characteristics. So that's what makes it the set of moral claims. So there's not any induction to do here. I think they might.
You've not looked at the set of moral claims. You looked at this one sentence and imagined it in your head.
Right, and the sentence isn't even an actual instance. So I on Huemer's blog, I don't know, maybe a couple years ago, I had a little dispute with him, and it kind of just petered out. I mean, it's a blog; people don't carry on conversations forever. But I was asking him what he even took a moral claim to be, and he gave like an example, like murder's wrong or something. I don't remember the example, but there's a sense in which I literally don't think, quote, murder is wrong, end quote, is a moral claim. That's not really a moral claim other than any more than like a photo of a tiger is a tiger. Or if I said, I don't know.
I know, I get what you're getting at. It's like it's an example for in the metaethics debate, right? Of like one of the premises in an argument put in quotes and taken out. But it's not like what you've not done is like sort of gone with a camera into a court or something and gone, oh, here's something like a judge said. Like
exactly, like moral claims are like events that occur in the world, and so you could say, hey, there are these events, and one of the things that happens in these events is people say this kind of sentence in English. They'll say murder is wrong. What are they doing in those instances? But that's not the data that analytic philosophers work with. They don't work with the actual moral claims. They imagine moral claims. And for me, analyzing these imaginary moral claims outside any particular context of usage goes back to something you said earlier. When I try to look at these, I literally think that they couldn't have any meaning unless I project or imagine a kind of phantom context. What would a person typically mean if they said murder is wrong? But you could imagine all sorts of sort of like fringe contexts where a person could say murder is wrong, and they don't mean what a person would mean in a literal context. A very simple one is simply sarcasm. There could be people who go, oh, like imagine a person gets caught shoplifting, and they say to their friend, oh yeah, because stealing is wrong. Well, they said stealing is wrong, but they actually mean the opposite. They don't actually think stealing is wrong.
Yeah.
But the tone is actually conveying their meaning, which is the opposite of what the meaning looks like. So philosophers want to strip those components of the language out, distill it into its pure semantics outside its pragmatic, remove all the pragmatics. But I think it's pragmatics all the way down. So there is no baby to preserve when you throw out the bathwater. There's just bathwater. And they just want to get rid of all the bathwater and then say, and now what's in the tub? Yeah. Nothing. There's nothing in the tub. Yeah, you could say, well, what would be in the tub if there were water?
There's a bunch of philosophers.
But so one other thing to say about that is, when I brought up my views about language, people will say, oh, well, you're presupposing or you're imposing your views of language on these discussions. Okay, I have to bring some view of language to bear. Why should the alternative view of language be like a default and then I have to
Mm.
propose some alternative, and theirs has some like, why is theirs privileged over mine?
Yeah.
If we need one of the views of language in order to start the discussion, shouldn't we resolve that background dispute about language first, rather than presuming their language view of language is the correct one? And then if I want to argue against it, I have this huge onus on me to show otherwise. Why is theirs privileged? When did they argue for their view of language?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not okay to put things like "hooray for the Broncos." Right? It's not okay to put the standard uncontroversial examples of non-assertive speech acts, but it is okay to put moral statements in there. Right? So
yeah, so the standard examples, like whose standard examples? Where's the list of the standard examples?
Yeah. One thing to note about using standard examples, in psychology, we have this problem where when you use stimuli that's supposed to be representative of a domain or category, you don't typically, and I don't even know what it would look like, to randomly sample instances of a particular domain. So take the domain of, for instance, moral transgressions. That is, those actions which we regard as morally wrong. And let's just set aside a whole bunch of assumptions. We all agree on which things are moral transgressions or not, and so on and so forth. Now, if I then start listing things like stealing, lying, killing, how much do those represent the domain of moral transgressions? I don't know. We would actually need to be able to randomly sample from the population of moral transgressions in order to get a representative sample. So it's not just
what even is that population though? Like every sentence that everyone ever has said that, yeah, it's not clear what the entire class is. Like,
right? How would you do that in principle? I don't know. As far as how you would do it in practice, you would not. You would not do it in practice, and so we're never actually randomly sampling from the domain. So when philosophers are talking about like typical or standard cases, these are ones that have it's a contingent feature of the way that philosophy is developed, that we happen to have glommed on to this particular subset. It's not just random. It's not like we just randomly grabbed 3 or 4, but we grab ones that we recycle and reuse because we've heard them a million times and we're comfortable and familiar with them and they're salient, or because they're rhetorically effective or they're emotionally evocative. What they aren't is representative of moral transgressions. Baby torture is not representative of a standard moral transgression because not that many people are torturing babies.
Or talking
so
about
like white lies would be much more representative of actual instances of candidate moral transgressions. And yet I don't see a lot of philosophers talking about that. And imagine how rhetorically ineffective it would be to say, well, Lentz doesn't even think white lies are ever wrong. Like, okay.
Or Stance independently wrong. Yeah, good point.
The non-cognitivists have to explain why it just looks exactly like these are propositions in like any test that you come up with in the language. Okay, so
any test that you come up with in the language where the test is my intuitions about what they mean.
Right. No, the tests are all sitting in a chair and not actually doing any research. Because like, what if we interviewed people and we did extensive interviews and we trained? I'm not saying that I think this would happen, but we interview everybody, we explain metaethics to them, and then like, let's just say hypothetically, 100% of non-philosophers were like, yeah, I just use them to express my emotions. What would he say at that point? Like, the point here isn't.
But then, given the standard he just set up, right, what you'd present back to him is you'd go, okay, it's all good that you just gave me all the evidence. So now let me see. Is P true? Well, that still seems like a proposition to me. You know, like, is P true? So, oh yeah, that still seems.
There's something about Huemer's approach, and I never end up talking about this with the phenomenal conservative approach. Well, I talk about it a little bit. Actually, I want to shut up a bit so we could get more into this. We're only 11 minutes into it, but it's this issue of phenomenal conservatism. As you'll see, I say in the video, one of the issues is that it doesn't really provide publicly valuable evidence. It only provides this kind of private justification. Very much like if I let's say I could talk to God or something, and God talks to me. I might have good reason to believe I could talk to God, but like no one else would have any good reason to believe me. They would all just think I'm hallucinating or delusional or something. And so the kind of evidence I typically would want a realist to present would be evidence that would be available to me even if I didn't have some sort of special faculty or intuition that realism was true. And so that's the kind of evidence I want. I don't just want, well, it seems true to me. Okay, well, it doesn't seem true to me. So why should I care?
So, what does it mean to wonder whether P, where P isn't a proposition? So you can wonder whether abortion is wrong. Like that makes sense. Okay, so it looks like moral statements assert propositions. So they're the kind of.
You see, I think I know what it means to wonder whether P, where P isn't a proposition in the sense that Huemer understands it because I have a different account of language and psychology and what's going on when people do this whole thing that I think I'm viewing Huemer as doing right now. That doesn't involve, metaphysical propositions about things, or, that his seeming being like a psychological faculty that attaches to a proposition or something in some way. So I think that is possible. And I think even I think, okay, maybe he's just genuinely not aware of any accounts that do that. But from my perspective, I'm aware of like my account and the rival account, and I sort of can compare them both. And I'm just very disappointed when philosophers who do this all the time, like, can't even present a rival account in one of these disputes where, there are people on the other side of it who are not just like completely insane or something, right? And go like, well, they've got something to say about this actually in response. They've been doing it a long time, full time as well. And I'm just going to compare, I have to compare and contrast the theories because there's not some obvious knockdown way in which they're wrong, right? Which is, I mean, maybe there are for some things, but it's just usually not the case when you've got people who are constantly resolving these kind of like tensions or, logical inconsistencies, whatever, in the worldviews. Like, and I don't think it's the case that there is a straightforward logical inconsistency or something. I think that there is an account, and now you've just got to compare them to figure out which one is the better one of the overall data.
A thing that should be either true or false. It's not plausible to say that they're always false. And it's not plausible to say that their truth value depends upon our attitudes. It doesn't depend upon the attitudes of the either plausible. The speaker personally or the speaker society in general.
It's not plausible to say. It's not, well, yeah, to you, because that's your conclusion.
Yeah. Or people in general. So it looks like there are moral statements that are true independent of the attitudes of observers, so there are objective moral facts.
Looks like.
And I don't really know. I don't know why this is not. This is frequently rejected, right, by the other two people here, but also by many other philosophers, and also people who are not philosophers, but just like scientists or other intellectuals. It's very frequent to reject.
That is curious that it's only the philosophers ensconced in this debate who use the words in this way. How curious. What can explain that?
Moral facts. And many people, I think, consider it incredible, right? I guess they find it counterintuitive, right? I find it
Wait, that's so weird. That's actually weird, because he's now saying that he thinks that many people find it counterintuitive, but he finds it intuitive. So I'm actually very interested to see how he resolves the different accounts of intuitions then.
Counterintuitive that there aren't moral facts, but some people find it counterintuitive that there are. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, I guess I just make some programmatic last remarks. Skepticism is very common in philosophy. When people start thinking about philosophy, professional philosophers and also just non-professional philosophers just start thinking about philosophy. It's very common for them to reach some incredibly skeptical conclusion. I'm sorry, my screen is going blank for a second there. Okay, it's very common for them to reach some incredibly skeptical, highly revisionary conclusions. And so I think there's just something that goes wrong. There's something that very commonly goes wrong in the human mind. Like when you start thinking about philosophy, that you just sort of forget the most obvious truth. It seems like it's okay to just start saying things that are radically revisionary and absurd on their face, which you wouldn't consider doing if you were in any other field. Like if you're in geology, one of the major theories in geology wouldn't be the Earth doesn't exist, rocks don't exist, there's nothing.
Do you have thoughts on that?
I do as well, because it seems that there's a tension in the sentences he just put side by side there, where he conceded that most people don't share his view and that it's fringe amongst scientists and ordinary people and they don't share this intuition. But then he's claiming that the revisionist and counterintuitive view for humanity is your position, which he's also claiming is the one that most people seem to share. So there seems to be some kind of tension in his thinking.
Hold up, did he say most people share my view? I had the impression he just said, yeah, lots of people have a view.
Sorry. Well, he said lots of people find my view. This is still a paraphrase. It's not exactly what he said, but the meaning was lots of people find my view of realism counterintuitive, right? But then he's also saying here that the rejection of his view is revisionary, right? And so there seems to be a tension between those two
Not
things.
necessarily, because by lots of people, he could mean 15% of people, or he could mean lots of people that...
Yeah, it's not specific. Okay, it's not specific enough to really pin it down, but I think there's at least my mind's hang on, there's some kind of, something's not right in that vicinity.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about what most people think, this is like, it seems plausible. This is why I prefer a philosopher specify. Are they saying what philosophers think, what non-philosophers think, what people throughout history think? He's not as specific as I think would be helpful in these debates, and maybe that's from long entrenched habit because nobody has really come along and really forcefully argued again. I mean, I'm trying to be at least a bit charitable here.
Yeah.
Nobody's really come along and challenged the presumption among many realists that their view is commonsensical and intuitive and obvious, and that most people speak, think, and act at least in some implicit way like realists. This has only happened, like how many people in the literature are doing that? Not that many, or at least not in any way that's. I don't know what's going on with that. But I'm not proposing anything that I would take to be radical or revisionary.
Well, I'd say in response to in response to Huemer's point though about it being like your view being kind of revisionary, you know, I guess in a sense I think that all of these meta-ethical views are sort of like revisionary relative to what most non-philosophers would say, just because most non-philosophers wouldn't say anything at all about these topics, right? So in this, so I get,
right, but even there, I'm not trying to revise how they think. Like if I'm
like
if you're a physicist and you're proposing a new theory of quantum mechanics, are you revising ordinary notions of physics?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's mistaken in the sense that the claim is that, you know, you're prescribing something that non-philosophers should say, and it's something that they otherwise wouldn't say. If we interpret Huemer to be saying that, I think that that's just false, right, and not true.
It's not true that I'm suggesting that they say that, or what?
I think it's not true that you're suggesting that non-philosophers make first-order ethical claims that they otherwise wouldn't make.
Oh yeah, well, I'm certainly not doing that. I'm not saying. Like, my position is not a position about what people outside of philosophical contexts should or do say. I'm just not making claims about that. I can make claims about that, but that's separate from saying I don't think there's sensitive.
Yeah, but not in meta-ethics. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think insofar as you interpret Huemer to be making that accusation, I think he's just like wrong or mistaken. But I do think that, you know, within his kind of like criticism here, he's just not. There's a number of different ways that you can interpret what he's saying, right? And he's just not being specific enough with what he's actually saying to really, you know, then rebut that in a sufficient way.
You know, like our entire subject matter doesn't exist. Or if you're in biology, one of the major theories would not be nothing is alive. There are no living things, right? And if we had to debate things like that, like they would have a hard time making progress. Like if there were a bunch of philosophers, you know, doing biology, we wouldn't have much progress in biology because they would refuse to admit that life existed, right? But in philosophy, like whatever the field is, there's always like one of the major things you have to talk about is whether the whole subject exists. Like, you're doing epistemology, and I have to talk to skeptics.
What, like, who is arguing that the subject of philosophy doesn't exist, or that, like, this is just not what's happening?
I think he's implying that anti-realists don't think morality exists, and you know, this is the title of Spencer Case and Matt Lutz's book, "Is Morality Real?" And you know, I read the book. There are many elements of the book that I like. I've recommended it to a few people because I like to see you know, a friendly exchange between a realist and an anti-realist. But I don't like the title of the book, "Is Morality Real?" Because the implication is that if you're an anti-realist, you don't think morality is real. Of course, I think morality is real. I just don't think that its realness involves stance-independent moral facts. And it often seems to me like realists seem to think that unless you think it's real in the way that we think it is, you don't think it's real at all. And that's just, you know, it's like, you know, I actually wrote a blog post about this where I have this allegory where it's like Jack and the Giant Beanstalk. Someone comes up to you and they're holding a handful of beans and they say, look, here I've got a set of magical beans. Do you agree that I am holding magical beans? And if you say, well, no, they're like, oh, so you're denying that I'm holding beans? You're like, no. I know you have beans. I just don't think the beans are magical. And they go, okay, but it's a non-negotiable feature of the object that I'm holding that it is magical. And so if you deny the beans I'm holding are magical beans, you're denying that I'm holding anything at all. That's absurd. And of course I'm holding beans. And so you're an idiot if you deny that. And so it's not allowing the person to say, I think you're holding a thing. It is beans, but it doesn't have the property of being magical. I think morality is real, but I don't think it has the property of being stance independent. I'm allowed to have that position. My position isn't beholden to or like it has to fall within the structure of what realists would consider real or not. You know, like it's like and I call this the halfway fallacy, the presumption that I'm allowed to reject realism, but I'm not allowed to reject that morality would only be real if it were real in the way that realists think it's real. Well, no, I reject that too.
Yeah, I've not clearly articulated in my own head exactly what I think is going wrong, right, from with like Huemer's point of view here, but it's definitely something in his meta philosophy to do with the way he conceptualizes what philosophers are doing, and there's some kind of sort of like mix up between the explananda and the explanations, right? Whereas from my point of view, in my meta philosophy, there's like a very sharp, distinct difference between the world is sort of all left in place. And then what we do as philosophers is we ask questions about things that we take to be happening. And maybe we even ask questions about our sort of interpretations of those things and the data and stuff. So it can get a little bit weird. But like in general, we're sort of in the project of trying to explain things, right? Whereas I think from Huemer's perspective, those things are a bit more kind of like tangled up, and that's why the metaphor gets a bit weird. So like the correct metaphor in the sciences from my point of view would be, I don't know, you'd look at experimental data like double slit experiments and so forth, and you say, well, how do we interpret that? And on one side, there's someone saying, well, it's purely an epistemic problem of whether something is a wave or a particle, or on the other hand, you might have like these other interpretations where it's like, no, it's ontologically real or whatever. And that is the dispute. But what you don't dispute about is whether the experiment happened or not. And similarly, in the case of metaethics, we don't dispute, like, it's not, your position isn't that like people never use the word right or wrong in English as they go about their daily lives or something, which he seems to be implying. Yeah.
I'm a moral psychologist. What do you think? I don't have a subject matter to study. Like, I study morality as there are aspects of our judgment, which you could call moral judgments. So we could do research on moral judgments. We could do research on how people use moral language. We could do research on moral institutions. We could do anthropological, psychological, sociological, neuroscientific research, all engineered towards operationalizing moral terms and concepts into some sort of empirically valuable phenomena and then studying it. And of course, I think we could do that. So of course, I think there is a sense in which morality is real, and it's a perfectly ordinary, conventional, everyday sense that I don't see anybody reasonably disputing unless there's some sort of like really hardcore skeptic about everything. So my view isn't that radical. Like, of course, I think people make moral claims. Of course, I think things matter to people. Of course, I think that we have moral institutions. Of course, I think we engage in moral judgment reasoning. I just don't think any of that involves anybody accessing via a special faculty, special, either conceptually really, I don't know what to say about it, but
yeah, entities that are stance independent but true and false, like linguistically or something.
Yeah, you don't have to have that particular view in order to think morality is real. Like, you just don't. So whether or not I personally find those sorts of views conceptually confused or metaphysically like unacceptable for some sort of, because they involve metaphysical commitments I don't share, why would that mean I don't think the thing exists? Like, do people think that people that are not Platonists about mathematics like don't think numbers exist? Like, you show them a bill that they have to pay and they're like, I can't pay that, I don't believe in numbers. Like, that, how bizarre would that be? Like, no, but I'm sorry, I'm a nominalist, numbers don't really exist, they're not real, so I don't owe you any money.
Yeah,
so you ask them how many children they have and they're like, there's no way to answer the question, numbers are real.
I can see a commenter who I think has still sort of misunderstood this point, but I think this is a good opportunity. Maybe there's a way in which we've not articulated this so they've said, I think this is intentionally obtuse. Ignore the moral accusation. If morality is stance independent, if you don't believe it's stance independent, if you don't believe in stance independent moral facts, morality isn't real. Well, I think that this is an equivocation on the term real, right? Because in the one sense, real is being used to mean a realist theory. And I think that this is an unfortunate artifact of, rhetoric within philosophy, right? If you look at the way that people carve up their positions, some people have called their positions, realist, and some people have called their positions anti-realist. And that has a rhetorical force because it's like, well, you're saying it's not real, I'm saying it's real. It's kind of similar to in politics, if someone wants to propose a certain type of tax and then you call it the death tax, it kind of has like a negative connotation. But the sense in which we're talking about real, right, is the explananda, like as in people, there is discourse within which people use these moral terms, right? Now that is real, and what we mean is that exists, that we observe people doing that those sentence constructions and things exist. And then the other sense of the term real is to do with, there are propositions which are truth apt and about facts in the world, stance independently, or something like that. And so that's just like an equivocation on real. And so it would be perfectly consistent to say, if there aren't stance independent moral facts, then, morality isn't real in the realist sense, but morality is real in the sense of, the phenomena that we're trying to explain is real, right? So I think we just have to be clear about that. And I think that, as for people doing philosophy, where philosophy is supposed to be about thinking carefully about these things, we'd want to disambiguate in that way and not sort of, let the fuzziness of language lead us into a bunch of false thoughts around this topic here, right?
Yeah, there's another issue. Can you bring that post?
Yeah. I lost it a little bit, but yeah, got it.
Note this part here. If morality is stance independent and you don't believe in stance independent moral facts, morality isn't real. Now, what's interesting about that is the last part, morality isn't real, because the accusation is that I believe morality doesn't exist. But let's say I believe I believe some anti-realist conception of morality is real. And then you ask me, do I think morality is real? And I go, yes, I believe in this anti-realist conception of morality. Now, if I'm, regardless of whether it turns like if morality is stance independent, I'm wrong about what morality is, but I still think morality is real. So there's something like, okay, if morality is stance independent and you don't believe in stance independent facts, morality isn't real. There's something very strange about that, because my view is a view about what is real, and my view about what is real is just different than what realists think is real. So, an example I've given is like a magician performing a trick. If a person witnesses that and they think the magician used real, like actual supernatural magic to perform the trick, and they say, I just witnessed supernatural magic, and I witnessed the same magician do the same trick, and I go, well, I agree they did a trick, but I don't think that the trick involved supernatural magic. It'd be very weird to say, well, if it was a supernatural event and you don't believe it was a supernatural event, what, then you don't think the event occurred? Like, that's weird. No, I do think the event occurred. I don't think the event involved supernatural. So this thing about morality isn't real. There's something very strange about that. The question is about what I believe, not what is the case. And it seems like it's mixing those two up. So there's something a little off about that.
Yeah, this conditional is actually a very weird construction. So I think on one interpretation, it's straightforwardly contradictory, right? So it's like, if morality is stance independent, right, and that's what it means for it to be real, and then you've got as the consequent, then morality isn't real. Well, then in that case, that is a contradiction. So it's like a logically impossible thing that you're sort of describing. Now, you could take it differently. You could say, morality is stance independent, meaning that there are stance independent moral facts, and then it says, but you don't believe in them, so then morality isn't real to you. Well, then, yeah, but I don't understand what the mystery is supposed to be in that case. You would just be mistaken, right? So I guess I'm kind of confused about what this is supposed to get at overall, really.
Yeah,
and I think it's
maybe
based
I'm just
on the
a little confused about it too. Can you put up? I don't think I have the ability to put up the next quote from Robert Saget. He's
whereabouts is it? Like a little while ago,
it's directly beneath the previous one you just.
Okay, let me find it.
1:06 p.m. So this one's so he's poo-pooing realism, but refusing to say what all the facts about morality actually are. He's evasive. This is a very strange claim, because I already said what I think the facts are. There's a bunch of descriptive facts. I mean, maybe I could say it more explicitly, but there's going to be a bunch of descriptive facts about morality. So there's descriptive facts about what people's moral beliefs are. There's going to be descriptive facts about how moral reasoning works. So you could get stuff like Josh Green's dual process theory of moral cognition. I don't endorse the theory, but that's one empirical attempt to get a handle on how moral reasoning and moral judgment and decision-making actually occurs, like what cognitive processes are involved in that. There are going to be anthropological questions, like how do people acquire moral beliefs? How do they differ across cultures within different subcommunities, that sort of thing. There's going to be developmental moral psychology. How do children learn about moral values? How do they distinguish them? So there's research from like Turiel, Nucci, and others on the moral conventional distinction and whether or not how that emerges and in what context it emerges and when it emerges. And so there's going to be all sorts of moral facts that are descriptive facts. What I don't think that there are irreducibly normative moral facts. So I don't believe that there are moral facts in the sense of there being facts about what we should or shouldn't do that are true independent of our goal standards or values. That's the only thing that I'm saying that I don't think that there are. But since I don't think that that's the only thing that would be constitutive of what morality is as a phenomenon, why would I take that to mean that morality doesn't exist? Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that morality is and that exists. It's just not that.
Okay, so let's play a little bit more of this then. And by the way, like, if you think that there are parts of this that I should skip over or skip to or anything, do let me know, because obviously you've got that in mind, and I think we're both aware of the ratio of commentary to video length.
Takes about whether anybody knows anything, right? Trying to figure out the nature of knowledge and how we know the things we know. But somebody said, no, nobody knows anything. And this is
Lance isn't saying that, so
relevant to bring up, because if it was just one common sense thing that philosophers were denying, then it might be plausible to think, oh, okay, so maybe we got that wrong. But like everything that the philosophers talk about, they start saying, oh, maybe that doesn't exist at all. Right? You're doing aesthetics, like what makes good art and what makes bad art. Some people will say, oh, there's no such thing as good art, right? Or you're talking about free will, like, hey, what makes people responsible for their actions or something? There's going to be a bunch of people saying, oh, nobody's ever responsible for anything, right? You're talking about the nature of the mind. There's going to be some people who say, oh, no, there's no such thing as the mind. We're all just mindless automatons, stuff like that. Okay, so then, like when there's, so many common sense things that the philosophers are denying, I think the reasonable thing to think is, there's something wrong with philosophers. And when you start feeling radically skeptical, it's probably a bias that occurs when you start doing philosophy, right? Rather than that, they're all of these seemingly obvious things don't really exist. Okay, that's all.
Well, I gotta say something quick about that. So there's this claim that like something goes wrong when you do philosophy. He's kind of making a kind of there's some psychological speculation about the history of how and why a person becomes an anti-realist. And to me, it seems implied that a person becomes an anti-realist by studying philosophy. And there's a certain sense in which I think that's like technically true, because I don't think people hold determinate metaethical positions prior to studying philosophy. But it's not like, in my case, I took on a bunch of stuff like I'm a naturalist and I'm a this and I'm a that, and therefore I'm an anti-realist. It's just this commitment that's downstream of all those other things. Anti-realism struck me as this sort of obvious default position from the outset. And it wasn't in virtue of like a bunch of like grudging theoretical commitments that I was like, well, this has got to be true. That just isn't what happened with me.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of making the argument that, all anti-realism is bad and sort of like something's gone wrong, right? And obviously, I mean, maybe all anti-realist positions are wrong, and the reason people have bought them is because they're doing philosophy. But I'm not certain he really gave good reasons there to think that criticism wouldn't apply to everything. That's the upshot of sort of like philosophical reflections. I would think that, his own views that are the upshot of philosophical reflections there are going to be just as susceptible to whatever problems are going wrong. And if he thinks not, like, why? Is it just because of these claims that he makes about his views being the ones that most people have, which aren't backed up then by empirical evidence and so forth? But further, I think it's just irrelevant, right? Because none of that stuff is stuff that you believe or are claiming. Like, you're not arguing we're brains in a vat. You're not arguing we can't know anything. You're not arguing that, well, I mean, I actually think maybe on the mind thing, he would disagree with you in a similar sort of way, because I think that, you sort of question the notion of qualia and consciousness and stuff like that. But still, like, you're not trying to make people sort of like buy into some metaphysical idealism or something that's sort of like really bizarre kind of overall view. You're just trying to argue that moral realism, which isn't something most people even know about, is false, right? And I think that's not, like, it's just irrelevant to mention all this stuff. It's only rhetorical force at that point.
Yeah, well, it does strike me as possibly, I'm hesitant to say this, but it does seem a bit like guilt by association, kind of like, hey, there's these other bad views over here, this view is like these views. Yeah. But I don't really think it's guilt by association, because I think he sincerely and genuinely he regards it as a member of a category. So it's not guilt by association, it's guilt by genuine inclusion in that category. And I'm just denying that that my position is stemming from some sort of skepticism. I don't see just imagine like Christianity were still dominant in academic philosophy today. You can imagine a Christian describing an atheist as having this radically revisionary view, that's super skeptical, and it's like, yeah, I don't believe like a dude rose from the dead and that there's talking snakes and like the Garden of Eden was a literal historical event. Oh, that's radically skeptical. Like, is radical skepticism just disagreeing with a view that's dominant within a particular academic field? Like, would I be radically skeptical if I was in like a seminary and I was an atheist? Like, maybe so. Would I be radical? Like, what exactly is meant by radically skeptical? Radically skeptical relative to what standard view?
I think what's interesting though about what he is saying there is that you actually agree with the statement that like there's something that goes wrong when people start doing philosophy in these contexts and thinking about these questions, right? So his sort of meta point that he's making, you agree with, but I think you've got sort of maybe a more robust mechanistic account of what's kind of going wrong there, right? And so it leads you to different positions on that. Anyway, I'll play it out.
Thank you. 11 minutes for that.
Start with that.
Do you want me to go through your opening statement, Lance, or do you want me to skip through?
It's going to be a lot of stuff I've already said.
Yeah. That's what I was kind of thinking. So maybe.
I don't know. Do you want to play? I don't know if people can handle like extra speed. Should we play quickly? I don't know.
yeah, I can say.
The last thing that Mike Huemer said about these like revisionary views that are absurd on their face, these radically skeptical views. I just completely outright deny that moral anti-realism is in any sense revisionary or radically skeptical. And part of the reason I deny this is because I deny that moral realism is a common sense position. In order for moral realism to be a allegedly common sense position, it would presumably need to be a position that is widely held among non-philosophers. However, I take the question of whether moral realism is widely held among non-philosophers, or at least whether people have realistic intuitions or speak or act in ways that reveal some sort of implicit commitment to realism, to be an empirical question. And that's what I do research on. So my area of specialization is the psychology of metaethics. And what I worked on in my dissertation was a question of, are most people without formal training in philosophy?
Okay, nobody's going to understand.
And the conclusion I came to was,
slow this down.
Yeah, you think it's too fast? I can do 2 times. Skill issue. No. Let's try 1.5.
No, that's not going to be too much.
It's like
1.5.
Okay, let's try 1.5. I think you're probably right. I don't know why I'm able to listen to it fast. Maybe I just like don't listen to the points because I'm a low information voter. Is my
Probably not. That does not mean that I think most of them are anti-realists. What I endorse is a position called folk metaethical indeterminacy. I don't think non-philosophers have realist or anti-realist intuitions prior to exposure to philosophy, nor do I think they speak or act in ways that determinately fit with a realist analysis of how they speak or think or act. And rather, I think that there's no need to attribute any presupposition of realism or anti-realism to how they think or how they speak at all. One analogy that Michael Gill gives in the paper Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics is that when we look at people commonly making use of numeric talk, mathematical talk, there's no particular reason to project or impose on them the necessity for them to endorse Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics. I think very much the same thing about ordinary.
I am going to comment on this point that you're making, which is that whilst I agree with the point, it may not work with someone like Huemer as like, something he would agree to against his position, because he might think that the best way to interpret the statements people are making is in terms of some mathematical realist account or something like that, right? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So what I agree, but if someone has sort of like reached this overall level of consistency, then it will be hard to find those examples that are like counterexamples to their theory.
There's a reason that I typically give a different example, and it's the example I actually start my dissertation with, and that is built into the title of the dissertation, Schrodinger's categories. Is I start by describing 2 people that are planning a barbecue, and they have a disagreement about what the weather is, and one of them responds by saying like whether it's going to rain or something, and they'll have to cancel the barbecue. And one of them ends up saying this like Copenhagen thing, like, well, whether there's going to be a barbecue is going to turn on these facts that are random and unpredictable, and so fundamentally we don't know. And then the other one says, well, no, actually what will happen is that quantum events will prompt the universe to split into different universes, some of which it rains and some of which it doesn't. And so we're definitely going to both be in a world where it rains and it doesn't rain. And I say, like, when you look at this conversation, this is obviously ridiculous. No one would ever talk this way because nobody actually has, like, most non-physicists don't have commitments about how to interpret quantum mechanics, and it's not a feature of everyday discourse. And I do have a study related to this where I looked at whether non-philosophers have views about quantum mechanics. They don't, not typically. But my point there is that, okay, well, what about when people make causal claims? Are they required to endorse like a hidden variable view or Copenhagen or something like that. No, that's silly. So maybe I should have used that example. So it's a fair point. Moral discourse that we don't require any particular commitment to realism or anti-realism. So there's a few more things I could say about this. One is that empirical research on how non-philosophers think about the question of realism or anti-realism is in its early days. Perhaps the most seminal work was a paper by Goodwin and Darley from 2008, so not that long ago, less than 20 years ago. There were earlier papers, 2003 or so. There's Nichols and Foltz-Bennett that looked at this, whether children are realists or anti-realists. Now that research, a lot of the focus of my own dissertation was on the methodological problems in the early research. Now I should say the early research did find a lot of conflicting judgments among non-philosophers. If you gave them questions that were intended to elicit their attitudes about realism and anti-realism, or judgments about whether a particular case was indicative of whether the case that they were presented with prompted them to give a realist or an anti-realist response, they get variable responses. However, Thomas Polzler, Jennifer Wright, and quite a few other people, James Beebe, started to note that
people who have just joined, the reason he's talking fast, we've got it sped up just because obviously Lance is here providing commentary, so we feel there's not a bunch to be gained sort of dwelling on everything he's got to say. It's going to be kind of what he's already said, so we'll hopefully get through that quick.
there were empirical issues with this research, and subsequent more rigorous methods have started to sort of peel back some of the methodological problems with those early
Opening
studies.
statement.
And this culminated in a paper that is probably the most rigorous to date, a paper called Anti-Realist Pluralism by Polzler and Wright. What they found there, at least among participants in the US, is that when they removed some of these methodological problems, they found that a substantial majority of the participants, about 3/4 across multiple different measures, tended to provide anti-realist responses to these sorts of questions. Polzler has collaborated in subsequent research with people to evaluate people in other countries, and they have continued to find that when you employ these better methods for evaluating people's responses to these questions, you get predominantly anti-realist responses. Now, do I think that means that most of these participants are anti-realists? No, it does not. But what we don't find is clear evidence that most people are realists. The way I've interpreted this evidence is I started looking at how people interpret these questions. And what it looks like is that the vast majority of non-philosophers do not interpret questions about metaethics in the way that researchers intend. And in many cases, they don't interpret them to be metaethical questions at all. And that will become relevant to this process of elimination approach that Huemer is employing here. The issue here is that when you ask people questions about metaethics, they often interpret them as questions about their normative moral standards, or they interpret them as epistemic questions about what people are in a position to know. I don't have time here to go into detail. I did do an interview on Joe Schmid's channel, Majesty of Reason, where I went into some of the details about some of the methodological issues of this research. Now, from looking at the data, how I interpret it is that the reason non-philosophers give inconsistent replies and appear to interpret these questions in ways that don't comport with the researcher intent of these questions, which is to elicit realist and anti-realist intuitions, is that they don't know what they're being asked because they don't have these concepts and they don't employ these concepts. Now, that's a big empirical question, but the bottom line is, I don't think it's actually true that realism is a common sense view. Now, why might it look like a common sense view when we look at this process of elimination approach? Well, I think the underlying issue here, at least one of the key issues, is one related to language. And I think that when Huemer sets up these scenarios, they superficially look like they support the realist analysis, but I don't think that they actually do support the realist analysis. There's a few things to say about that. First, in all of the cases where we are evaluating whether or not the particular anti-realist position on the matter is plausible or not, or sounds right or not, we have to rely on our own judgments in these cases. And I don't share Huemer's intuitions about these cases. So at least one issue is that to a significant extent, from my understanding, Huemer relies on phenomenal conservatism. And even if we grant phenomenal conservatism as an appropriate epistemic tool for the sake of argument, and I understand that he can correct me if this isn't an accurate or adequate characterization, is that to the extent that something seems true, we have some sort of initial justification for believing that in the absence of defeaters. Now, if we grant that for the sake of argument, I have no problem with a realist saying when they look at these cases, it seems to them that like realism wins out in the analysis of these scenarios. In the absence of defeaters, of course, it could be that the anti-realist comes in and says, here's a bunch of arguments against realism, and then the realist goes, okay, well, it seems to me like realism is true, but these things are right. That isn't really the typical approach I would take. Rather, when I look at these cases, I don't have the realist seemings in the first place. And so that already puts us to a certain degree at an impasse unless we move past those fears. Part of the issue I have with phenomenal conservatism is a couple of them. One is that at best, it only appears to provide, at least mostly, private justification. It doesn't provide justification in a way that is sort of publicly available to others. An example that I've given when I've discussed it before is, suppose I was wandering through the woods and I run across Bigfoot. Now, do I think Bigfoot exists? No, but suppose I did run across Bigfoot. I spent a whole lot of time hanging out with Bigfoot for like a week. Well, I would have the reason to believe Bigfoot existed. Like, let's say, I don't do drugs. I have no reason to think I was drugged. I'm with Bigfoot for long enough that, it's really implausible this is a dream or I'm hallucinating. I don't take a radically skeptical view that, like, you could always be hallucinating. It's so implausible it could be Bigfoot. So in that position, I would say you're absolutely justified in believing Bigfoot. But once you left the woods and started telling other people I ran into Bigfoot, they would have no particular good reason for believing, no matter how good your testimony was, unless there were independent means of corroboration. So when a realist says that they have realist seemings, fine, I'm happy to grant that, but I don't have those seemings. And so then there's a question of, like, whose seemings are stronger here, or we have to start turning to the...
I'm going to comment on this point you're making as well, Lance, because I remember, like, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, where almost every other day you made a Facebook post about not knowing what people meant when they had realist seemings. And I think at the time, I don't know if I was so on board with you, but I think your reading your various sort of rants on this has changed the way I've come to think of it. And I know, when I reflect on where I would use the word intuition, where other people use the word intuition, I sort of like consult my background knowledge or what seems true to me or something like that, right? I mean, I have like beliefs that I have, things I would say I believe that, whatever. And then it seems like there's sort of an additional claim alongside any belief, like a realist interpretation of that belief or something. So like, that seems to be another belief. And then I just think that that's true or false. But my seeming or whatever, my intuition with respect to realism just seems to be like a first order belief about realism, but it isn't connected to, because of the distinction that we've already sort of articulated that we have between the first order moral discourse and the other one. Like, my intuition about whether or not I think murder is wrong for me is just completely disconnected from my intuition about like realism. And I guess I struggle to understand what it would mean for me to like intuit this is wrong and realism is true, like be the content of that like seeming whatever. And I don't know what people mean by like that realism comes along with a seeming or something, a seeming in a way where they can't imagine that even being wrong or something. Like I just find it this like very mysterious. Like, what do you mean? Like I have an interpretation of my experiences that I can't like deconstruct or something. Like it's very suspicious.
Yeah, it seems like, to me, it's funny because I say it seems to me. First of all, I should address that. When I use terms like seems or it appears or this sort of thing, I'm not making any claims that are presupposing or helping myself to the phenomenological presuppositions or other sorts of philosophical views that Huemer or non-naturalist realists have about what seemings are. I don't think I have intellectual seemings. Like, so if you ask me, hey, do I think 17 is a prime number? Oh, well, I have it. It seems like it is. A lot of times it seems to me, again, I'm self-conscious of the fact that I'm using the term seems, that they're describing a kind of phenomenology that is quasi-perceptual. Like when you consider a certain proposition, it's like you're seeing that it's true or false, like seeing in some sort of metaphorical sense. And this is presumptively through the operation of some special faculty, some intellectual faculty. I don't think there is a distinct intellectual faculty. And why would I use, so if this is meant to be literal, like I'm perceiving truth, I don't think I could do that. If this is meant to be a metaphor, what kind of metaphor? Like for what? Like what is in fact actually going on if this is not meant literally? Like
I struggle to see
quasi-perceptual language.
I struggle to see what this language can mean other than a propensity to basically say certain statements. That's really the only way I see this language being like cashed out in terms of actual stuff. I mean, I can understand that some people, obviously there's this alternative view of language to my own that's more, this propositional, representational content view. And so there's kind of like metaphor of maybe when I have a propensity to say something is true, I then have an account behind that of like a proposition that I'm accessing or something, or so, but I don't know what the phenomenology of that is supposed to be like. Like I don't, it's not my own phenomenology. Isn't like I'm now accessing a proposition or something. I produce language and do stuff and make noises. I can even like say sentences in my head, sort of like in my verbal voice, but it's not like I'm saying the sentence through time. It's not like there's a time independent true or false proposition in my mind. It's like it's very the imagery, I don't know what it's supposed to really refer to, that other than speech behavior. Like
I'm the same as you in this regard. And when I've read the way non-naturalist realists describe their phenomenology, it seems very impoverished. It's not very well described in terms of like actually trying to cash out what the experience is like for them. There's a very good chance, in fact, I would pretty much guarantee that there are places where they have given more detail to these descriptions and I simply haven't read them. I would very much like to read them. And I really do mean that. I mean, I'm going to remain skeptical. I am so confident and entrenched in my current position that it's very unlikely I'm going to change my mind. I find it a little frustrating if somebody takes that to mean like, oh, you're closed-minded or something like that. Yeah, I'm pretty entrenched on the Earth not being flat. Does that mean I'm so close-minded that if someone actually presented good evidence, I'd refuse to accept it? Of course
Well,
not.
if I had a flat earther here, Lance, actually, they would say, they'd be like, yeah.
Right, they might say that. But of course you're going to say that if you're super convinced of a position that another person is super convinced it's not true. So it's just that I'm very confident that it's false and that no one's going to present good evidence. And those often go hand in hand. And it's the same.
It doesn't mean you wouldn't listen to it and change your mind if it was
right.
good evidence.
Right. It wouldn't mean that I would say I refuse to listen. It wouldn't necessarily mean that I would be so biased and so severely vulnerable to motivated reasoning that I would be incorrigible. I don't think I would be. So when people say if you're biased or there's motivated reasoning or you're not open-minded, if they want to say I'm skewed in ways that go beyond the intellectual merits of the position towards my current view, of course I am. Everybody is. That would be a trivial thing to say. It's only a matter of degree. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to say about the phenomenology here is there's a lot of stuff to me that strikes me as super weird about it. Like their phenomenology involves counterfactuals. Like this seems like it would be wrong even if I thought otherwise. How the hell can that be part of your experience?
Well, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, my take on this is basically like, this is, again, you know, the analytic philosophy's obsession with like propositional semantics and like modal semantics, right? And like, so the biggest works in analytic philosophy are like, you know, like Kripke's works and things like that. And there seem to just be like these models of interpreting statements about possibility and things and you know, truth aptness and so forth that a lot of philosophers just accept uncritically and then build like a mental model of what's going on when that type of language is used, that I think is just, you know, so much different to that if you look at it through the perspective of like a linguistic framework or something. Like what's going on when people talk about causation, prediction, control and stuff? Do they like have Kripkean modal semantics in mind? No, I really don't think they do. I don't think that's the best account of that language, but you know, that's a broader debate.
Yeah, well, and this feeds into my general views on the matter, which is that I suspect that analytic philosophers, in virtue of what they study and how they think about these things, develop to the extent that it's a phenomenology and not just mistaken inference. Like, so one thing I think people are doing is just making inferences and then mistakenly taking those to be part of their phenomenology. The other is that they may genuinely have a distinct phenomenology, but I don't know why analytic philosophers are so confident that their phenomenology, their experience of the world, is representative of everybody else's experience of the world, especially because they are a narrow demographic group within even a narrow demographic group. So almost all of them are part of like a weird population, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But they tend to come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They tend to receive specialized training. They tend to read a shared canon of text that is not quite as systematic as the Bible, but we still have our Hume and our Kant and our Descartes and our Plato. Like they read the same text, they take the same courses, they're taught the same things, they develop their own idiosyncrasies, and like philosophers will say, I put the gloss on this. They use terms like gloss in weird ways that are only used in certain academic contexts. So they have like their whole distinctive terminology. So they are one of the most psychologically unrepresentative demographic groups in the entire world that make up. There's only there's like a few thousand. How many are there? 50,000? 100,000? Like if we're counting PhDs, I don't know.
What? Sorry, I missed the.
How many people have PhDs currently alive in philosophy? Probably not that many. It's a few tens of thousands. And so you're talking about this incredibly tiny proportion of people that all got funneled, analytic philosophers I mean specifically, that all got funneled through an extremely narrow, like they pass through the eye of the analytic needle, they come out the other end, and then they say everybody thinks the way I do, without a shred of empirical evidence that anybody does. And when you do get the empirical evidence, they just insist up and down it's not relevant. What the hell? It's super weird. It's like if a bunch of people lived in a cave for 100 years and they only read the works of a specific person, and they came out and they said, everybody thinks the way we do. And you say, oh, can you ask them? No, I just think, and I know how they think. What the hell is that? Why do they do that? Why don't they just ask people? Like, you know, experimental philosophy's only been around for 20 years, like the actual practice of asking people. And it's had a pretty lukewarm and mixed reception among the philosophers. A lot of them don't like it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think this gets back to, several of the questions Huemer raised, where he said, I don't know why this is the case about, people disagreeing with his intuitions and things like that. And I think that, your view provides a very good account of the ways in which philosophers and the ways they use words like intuitions depart from the ways that other people do, right? And I agree that I don't think Huemer's model can accommodate some of that data, and that's why, there's a disagreement in that area that's maybe more fruitful than the one you're having about metaethics. But yeah, let's play this out. But do you know, just in terms of the overall thing, Lance, like how much of this is like the discussion between the two of you? Like, are there key points in this to jump to? Or
Huemer talks, I think, for about 10 minutes, and then I think I talk for about 20 minutes, and I get too excited about all the empirical stuff, and curiosity cuts me off at some point.
Okay.
So it's probably around the 30, 35-minute mark where it moves towards open discussion.
Okay, so maybe if I skip around there, let's.
If you like torching baby, you still shouldn't do it. So it'll take a while. Now, my claim isn't that most people have a direct intuition that moral realism is true. So most people have never heard of moral realism, I don't think. And if you try to explain it to them, it's going to take a while for them to even understand what you're saying. And it doesn't seem hard to understand to us because we're like philosophy people and we're familiar with it, but you just take a person off the street or an undergraduate and you try explaining to them. It'll take a while for them to even understand the question. So they might not have intuitions about that specifically.
Yeah, but then this is what's kind of like great that he is accepting that. But then if he's not making the claim when he says it's intuitive, that it's intuitive to most people, or most people think this, and he's just making the claim that to moral realists like myself, it's intuitive. Isn't that kind of like you're just saying like I believe it, and so I find that it's most probably true or something like, and it's like, yeah, well, obviously, right? That's like your belief. Like, why is that insightful? Why does that give us like? Why can you double count your reasons? It's like, it's my conclusion, and the fact that I think my conclusion is true is like an additional reason that my conclusion is true.
Well, he says a bit more about this. I think his view is roughly that it's not that people explicitly adhere to realism, but that they would, under a certain sort of truth-conducive set of counterfactual considerations that they could be presented with. So, like, you take the person in the street, they don't know anything about the views in question. You have a bit of a Socratic dialogue with them, and people would be you could extract from people the fact that they're inclined towards realism. I think
isn't that just an empirical claim though? Again, right? It's like, well, you could make the prediction, but I don't think you're warranted strongly believing it until you've actually put people through this set of tests that are supposed to derive their view about what they think about these things, right? But
yeah, obviously I think that. Empirical question, what would happen? And it would be incredibly difficult to do that in a way that wouldn't be potentially leading. I mean, this is part of why, again, like that, I go with this analogy to Schrodinger's categories, is I say that people prior to studying philosophy exist in a kind of a sort of philosophical superposition that's only collapsed by engaging in philosophy. But look at the state of contemporary theoretical physics, where the Copenhagen position was ascendant for a long time. Does that mean the Copenhagen position is actually more plausible than the many worlds interpretation or hidden variable views? Not necessarily. Views can become established within a field of science for like sociological or historical reasons, not due to the merits of the position. And you have the same issue here, which is that if you are trying to train people to understand the metaethical issues at stake, there's going to be a bunch of questions as to how one would go about doing that. Like if Huemer did it, or an analytic philosopher did it, that says, like as Huemer does in ethical intuitionism, you got 5 options. Huemer actually says in the book, these are the only logically possible options. And my view doesn't fall within those categories. So if you framed it to people as your options are naturalist realism, non-naturalist realism, non-cognitivism, error theory, stance-dependent theories, I don't accept that framing. So how are we going to instruct people? What kind of Socratic dialogue are we going to engage in? Because any dialogue we engage in that tries to explain these positions to people will, to some extent, require taking on board certain presuppositions that I might not share or that other philosophers might not share. So it's already taking a stance on background issues, and that's already potentially funneling and biasing and channeling people towards one position over another. I mean, this is just a very common feature. And this is, so I'll just make a point about what I do with the quantum mechanics stuff. I ask people, do you have a view about quantum mechanics? Did you have a view prior to the study? They say no. I tell them a bit about Copenhagen and many worlds, and then I ask them to pick one. 100% of people pick one. Does that mean that they have a view about how to interpret quantum mechanics? No. But if a philosopher is going to say, hey, here's a menu, pick something on the menu, of course people are going to tend to pick something on the menu. not too many people are going to have
Yeah, right. I
the
get what you mean.
wherewithal to be like, I think this framework is flawed. And so even the act of presenting these questions in an analytic
Yeah, I see.
is already presupposing that the analytic context is the appropriate way to address the questions. And that's the very crux of the whole dispute I'm rejecting. So like, no, he uses process of elimination. My response isn't, no, the process of elimination fails because one of those three anti-realist positions is correct, is I say, you haven't eliminated all the alternative positions. So this is a huge problem to operate under this sort of assumption that were we to go down this route, people would go in my direction. That's an empirical question, but it's also a potentially intractable empirical question. How can you test people without presenting some aspects of a theory?
Yeah, there's some very complicated and difficult questions of experimental design there, and how you could get good evidence that where you didn't like confound your results in some way. So yeah, I agree with you there.
But so I'm trying to appeal to other intuitions I think they would have, like you shouldn't torture babies for fun. So I claim they have that intuition, and also that it makes sense to say things like, well, if you shouldn't torture babies, then you shouldn't get your little brother to torture babies.
I think there's something interesting here as well. Like maybe when he says, like, if someone reports they have an intuition, right, then you have to assume that his metaphysical like theory of what it means for someone to have an intuition is correct. And then that's where you get moral realism from, right? Or something like that's the way his argument kind of works, I think. Like he has like a metaphysical model of what it means to have an intuition. So if someone reports to have an intuition, like therefore his metaphysics is true, and that entails, moral realism, stance independent moral facts or something. Is that?
I don't know. I have an anxiety about being a completionist about this. You started about 35, but I think he actually started about 34, 50, or 34, 30.
We're never getting through
what he says right at the start of this.
Okay.
Just to make sure we don't miss anything.
Yeah, don't worry.
Counterintuitive views or something. Now, my claim isn't that
right before this. Let's just see exactly where he starts. Saying it's true because that's just trivially true. Of course, that's true. But that's not. I just want to see exactly how he starts. So I don't think appraiser relativism really falls to semantic analysis so easily.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lance, for the opening statement. And now we are getting into the open discussion phase of the debate. So, Mike, you can go ahead with your response to Lance's opening statement.
Yeah, good. So I guess I clarify some things that, I was saying, the anti-realists have these radically counterintuitive views or something. Now, my claim isn't that most people have a direct intuition that moral realism is true.
Sorry.
Thanks, Lance.
I was trying to listen,
and also,
it was impossible.
Yeah. It's. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot to go through, which is why I'm thinking, are there some kind of like key flashpoints that we can jump to or something?
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that we skipped over, it's pretty straightforward. I argue one, moral realism is not the common sense view. There's nothing radically skeptical or revisionary about my position. And two, my position falls outside the scope of the process of elimination approach that Huemer holds, because the traditional three anti-realist positions rely on presuppositions about language and meaning that I reject. And that's it.
Yeah.
I could have made it a lot more concise than 20
yeah.
Even if you like torturing babies, you still shouldn't do it. So stuff like that. And then, the claim is that you could do some reasoning from common sense claims that would get you to moral realism, rather than that moral realism is itself immediately intuitive. Lance said that he didn't share my intuitions, but I wasn't sure which intuitions he meant. So, maybe clarify if, does he mean it doesn't seem to him like you shouldn't torture babies for fun, or like that doesn't seem true, or it does seem like it matters how you feel about it. So, you don't.
I am a little bit surprised though that he doesn't know this as well, but I mean, yeah, fair enough.
Share the intuition that if you had different attitudes, it would still be wrong to torture them, or so. Just be more specific about that, I guess. Okay, is there a fact of the matter? So Lance said they didn't think there was a fact of the matter about the meaning of moral claims, and I'm a little confused by that phrasing. They're not being. I don't know what it means for there to not be a fact of the matter. Like we say the stuff, it's not meaningless, right? So it means something. But then I thought, well, maybe he just meant that it has different meanings in different contexts for different people. Okay, so that's okay, but I only need there to be like one context in which it means what I say, and it has a realist meaning, and it's plausibly true. Okay, so when I say if it's wrong to do something, and it's wrong to get your little brother to do it. Okay, so then that couldn't have the non-cognitivist meaning. So if there's just some context in which I could say that, and it would be plausibly true. Okay, and and wrong doesn't express an emotion, and it doesn't refer to our attitudes. Okay, and then and it's also got to be a context in which it's plausible that that's true. But it's highly plausible that there are contexts in which all of that is the case. Let's say you're reading some of the ethics literature and they're talking about whether abortion is wrong. All right, so they're clearly not just expressing their feelings or trying to influence your actions, and they're not just reporting their own attitudes. So it looks like it has a realist type meaning, right? And it's not some weird philosopher thing, like although it's philosophers talking like other people understand what they're doing, right? Arguing about whether abortion is wrong. Okay, and then you might think, oh yeah, but maybe the stuff they're saying there is false. Okay, but say in the course of this article about abortion, they're like, okay, so everyone agrees that murder is wrong. Now let's figure out whether abortion is like that, and then. So when they say everyone agrees that murder is wrong, it looks like that has a realist meaning. In other words, it's not being used to express a feeling.
It looks like that has realist meaning. Like again, does it? It doesn't to me. Yeah.
Or try to influence people, and it's not reporting our attitude. So, and looks like it's also true. Okay, so now, and then if you're committed to saying, oh yeah, so in that context it was just a false statement, then I think that's radically counterintuitive, I guess. And okay. Okay, so then my argument against the error theorist is, oh well, you guys are committed to saying it's not wrong to torture babies. That seems crazy, right? Or when you're reading the article about abortion, they're like, everyone agrees murder is wrong, but is abortion really murder? Okay, only if fetuses are people or something like that, and they go up in there. And then if you're committed to saying no, they were wrong when they said that, that murder is wrong. I think that's a crazy position. Now, and then Lance said something like, well, what the error theorist means is that there's not a stance independent fact about it. No, that's not what they mean. Right? What they mean is the ordinary statement murder is wrong is false, right? Because it's part of their theory that, like, the reason why they're error theorists and not non-cognitivists is that it's part of their theory that the ordinary statement means what the realist says that it means.
Can you pause here?
Like, they agree with the realist.
I don't remember exactly what I said, but it's a little weird that I very much doubt I mischaracterized what error theorists think. I think I laid out what they think pretty clearly. I could go back and look, but it seems like he's correcting me here about error theory when, like, it's very clear what error theory is. Error theory is ordinary moral claims purport to describe stance-independent moral facts. There are no stance-independent moral facts, so the ordinary claims are wrong. I mean, my whole position on normative entanglement, when it's used against error theory, turns on that being the case. So this was a strange thing for him to clarify. I wonder what I said that prompted that reaction. I'm just going to grant I must have said something that gave that impression, but it is a little strange because this gives if someone jumped into the exchange here, it looks like I don't know what error theory is, and he's correcting me that. It's real weird.
Lance, do you want me to just play this for a minute while I go to the toilet, or do you want to play it on your share while I go to the toilet? Because I really need the toilet either way.
So just play it, I guess.
Okay. I'm sorry if a really good point comes up that you want me to pause on, and I'm just not here.
We'll deal with it.
List about how it's reporting a fact. So yes, they're saying there isn't a stance independent fact, but they're also saying that means that the ordinary statements are false, and so that means they're in conflict with common sense. So okay, let's see. Did I get to everything I want to talk about? Let me see. And I don't know. I guess I'll just make a general remark about intuition and phenomenal conservatism. So my claim is all of this discussion is based on our intuitions. You don't have. There's not like a philosophy discussion in which you're not relying on your intuitions. It's just that sometimes you label them that, and sometimes you just intuit things without saying that they're intuitions, right? But so that being the case, it seems like you shouldn't accept a position that relies on less plausible intuitions, right, over one that relies on more plausible intuitions. Okay.
All right, Lance, you can go ahead with your response to that. It's an open discussion, so yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I was a little puzzled by the last thing because I thought I was quite clear in my characterization of error theory as being committed to both the semantic thesis, a claim about ordinary speakers, and that what they mean is that those people are wrong when they make those claims. In fact, that was actually part of my point about it not being the case that the error theorist is really committed to anything so egregious as it might seem. That's part of the point of normative entanglement. All they're committed to saying is, hey, the people over there, when they say that stuff, there's an implicit presupposition in what they're saying. That presupposition is false, and so those people are systematically mistaken. The issue here is that you give this statement like the error theorist is committed to saying that it's not morally wrong to torture babies. Sure, to the extent that they're committed to saying that, that's supposed to be crazy to put in your terms. I don't see why that's crazy because all they're committed to saying when they say that is to the extent that this statement, as long as they're employing that language in the sense that ordinary people mean it, in the sense of what they think is a belief or an implicit commitment to there being stance-independent facts, what they think makes that statement false is the commitment to stance-independent facts. There's no other aspect of that they're denying. So the claim is both a normative claim, a claim about the rightness or wrongness of torturing babies or whatever it would be, and a metaethical claim. So if you look at if you imagine an exchange like a real assassin theorist, hey, you think it's or an error theorist in particular, hey, do you think it's morally wrong to torture babies for fun? Well, the error theorist, if they're responding to that by employing the language in the ordinary sense, the answer would have to be no. They can't say yes to that question. But notice if they say yes, they're saying yes simultaneously to both the meta-ethical question, whether there are any stance-independent facts at all, and the normative question that they're opposed to torturing babies, that they think on normative grounds is more than one. But if they say no, that's actually ambiguous between three possible positions of the person could hold. They could think that there are stance-independent facts, but that the wrongness of torturing babies isn't among them. So they could say no, even though they're a realist, but they just think they think it's permissible to torture babies. They might think that they're saying no to both questions, so they could still think that it's okay to torture babies, but they also don't think there's stance-independent facts. Or they might think something like what I would think, which is that I do think it's wrong to torture babies just for fun, but I don't think it's stance independently wrong. But if an error theorist is responding to that question, because the meta-ethical question and the normative question are bundled together, it can make it pragmatically implies if they say no, that they're like an awful, terrible person. It's implying they're okay with baby torture. And that actually isn't an implication of error theory. An error theorist just isn't committed to being okay with baby torture. And I think the sense that the error theorist looks, quote unquote, crazy is because it looks like to people that aren't being careful about what the error theorist is saying, that the error theorist is okay with baby torture. And they don't have to be. An error theorist could literally be out personally stopping people from torturing babies. They could be a crusader dedicated to stopping people from torturing babies with a far greater commitment than every realist on the planet. And they could still respond by saying, it's not morally wrong to torture babies. So, I don't know if we want to discuss that, or I should go through your list. I don't know the best way to handle this.
I don't know. Okay, so yeah, so there's this error theorist who says, God, I absolutely hate baby torture, but it's not morally wrong. Okay, so now does that make their position plausible? Okay, so now they've canceled the implication that they're okay with baby torture. So then that should eliminate any implausibility, and so then that derives from that. So, no, that still seems like a radically counterintuitive position, right?
Well, it doesn't seem that way to me.
Oh, okay.
I don't find anything remotely counterintuitive with that. Seems fine to me. I don't see what the problem would be. What I would have a problem with is if a person was okay with baby torture. I don't care if they deny stance-independent moral facts, because I don't find the notion of stance-independent moral facts to be remotely plausible. And so this is what happens in, like, we could just copy paste the same point about all of the scenarios that where once you unpack, like, the subjective is saying, yeah, if a person says that it's morally okay to torture babies, that statement is true. All a appraiser relativist is committed to is saying, hey, when that person says it's okay to torture babies, what they mean is, I approve of torturing babies. And if the person approves of torturing babies, they might as well be saying, I approve of torturing babies. Well, of course that's true, but that says nothing about whether the appraiser relativist has to be okay with that person torturing babies. And so again, I think the extent to which it prompts us to think that the appraiser relativist looks crazy is only by failing to disentangle failing to adopt their perspective and disentangle what they're committed to once you unpack the analysis versus interpreting it outside of that analysis. So it's the same sort of thing.
Well, okay, so we might have a clash of intuition. Let's say we do have a clash of intuitions. Okay, but just
hang on. I mean, maybe he's going somewhere with this. I'm just thinking, like, it would seem more important to engage with what you just said there, but maybe he will.
Like my intuitive reaction is just like, that's wrong. That should come out as a true statement. Now, I'm not assuming it's intuitive that is stance independent. I'm just assuming it's intuitive that it's true. And then you have to do a little bit more work to figure out whether it's stance independent or not. Okay. But, you might just think, I
think you've kind of made the same point there, right? Like, you can kind of sign up to that, right?
Well, I end up saying, like, there's something weird about this, like, two-step way of analyzing it. So I give you the sentence, torturing babies for fun is wrong. True or false?
Yeah.
Now, if a realist is asking me, I'm going to ask them, do you mean true, like, stance independently true, or some other sense?
Yeah.
And if the response is no, we're not addressing that question yet. I first want to know if it's true or false. True or false in what sense? So stance independently or not, in the pragmatic sense, in a deflationary sense, in a truth correspondent, like, which theory of truth are we going with? And so I end up saying something like, I don't think questions about an undifferentiated notion of truth are answerable. They're undefined.
Well, this is the thing that I think you would say. I think you tell me though. Like, I think there are contexts within which you would be, asked a moral question and you would tick the box like that statement's true, whatever, and you can still say, but then there's to interpret that as meaning, divine command theory true, wrong, like, as something is just an additional thing I would not tick correct to on the box. So there's no, like, inconsistency between the set of, like, views that I hold together. It's not like by ticking the true box there on that one, I also committed myself to moral realism, because I just didn't mean that. Now, if you mean that, right, then there's just an additional question that you should be asking me.
Right, but if you say true, then they might say, "Oh, so you're a cognitivist, and now you're gonna have to commit yourself of stance-dependent or constructivist view." Well, hold up. When I say true, I'm not committed to a view about ordinary moral semantics.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's
I mean, you could be a non-cognitivist still and say true. That's the like
right.
your view
Good.
permits that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because you could have some deflationary view of truth. So you could have some quasi-realist perspective where
yeah.
the sense in which you think it's true is not the sense in which would allow one to say that it's true on some sort of robust cognitivist account that would in any way give you something like the robust kind of realism that humor endorses. But the other thing is just like, if you're not giving me a disambiguated conception of truth, if there isn't a presumptive context where I know what you're asking me, then what am I supposed to do? Am I interpreting true and other aspects of the question in accord with what I think you're asking me on your view?
Yeah, yeah.
Am I interpreting it in accord with what I think on my view? Like what are you asking me to do? And if
Well,
I'm
this
not
is
going to say, please disambiguate, how the hell am I supposed to answer the question?
So I think what I'm saying is like, look, you can sort of give an answer to that for the sake of being nice or getting along, right? It's not like you're trying to be you know to show that you're not trying to be obtuse or whatever. But you can't read anything useful off of that answer because it's so like underdetermined what all of the relevant terms actually meant in your answer, like, or what you meant by giving that answer. You have to unpack that and get it.
Yes, and I have to be sensitive to all the pragmatic. Like, let me ask you this: predict what I would say if I'm on. I'm at a big national, like I don't know. I work for the U.S. government, and I'm in front of all the cameras and all the media. And someone says, "Do you think it's wrong to torture babies for fun?" What do you think I would say? Or do you think it's true that it's wrong to torture babies for fun?
You
And
just say
true
yes,
or
right?
false.
Very confidently, true.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. So you accurately predict what I would say and say, "Of course it's wrong. Of course that's true."
Yeah.
Now,
because you can't even show hesitation because that would be bad with the low information voters. And yeah.
Exactly. So of course I'd say it's true. Now, what am I doing there? I'm affirming I'm against baby torture. That doesn't commit me to any meta.
You're talking about moral realism.
Huh?
You're talking about moral realism to the nation.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be though. I'm saying,
I'm
I'm against this baby torture stuff. And like, we're all on board with that. And it has nothing to do with my meta-ethical views. Because in that context, I would understand that it would, so you could say, so you're being dishonest, you're being a fictionalist. No, I'm understanding that in that context, to say no, technically, like no, but not only would no one would understand me. No, the first thing they would think, hey, the guy's cool with baby torture. He's a maniac. Like you have a responsibility when you're talking to the public to not talk in a way that's so technical that you would confuse or mislead them. Like if an astronaut thought that like technically the Earth wasn't habitable because it wasn't technically right outside some established habitable zone, it'd be really weird to say the Earth is like, let's say like they have like a precise zone and the Earth like changed its orbit a little bit and it moved it outside of it. What if like a NASA person was like, yeah, the Earth is no longer habitable? That would really confuse the public. Like it's no longer in the habitable zone. Like not that this isn't like the best example I could come up with, but the point is just that if you're a representative of a particular technical position, you have a responsibility not to speak in technical terms. When doing so would actively mislead or confuse people. So hell no, I wouldn't say no in that context. For entirely legitimate reasons. And I think it takes a sensitivity to the social context in which you're talking to be aware that a person's responses can legitimately differ for reasons that are not insincere or disingenuous or anything like that.
I think, there's the broader problem is that these kind of like decontextualized intuition pump cases are just not the way that language functions, right? Language only functions in specific contexts, and then that's where you can interpret communicative intent and meaning. Because like even in that political case that you're giving, I don't even know that you would be making like a first order moral claim, insofar as your function there as a politician would be more to communicate the party's position on a wedge issue, or like, how the policy that you intended to enact or something like that, right? Which doesn't even necessarily mean that you have a particular moral view about it. It might be very like Machiavellian. So like the pragmatics of real human communicative context, like just a very diverse and particular, and that this idea that you can just like abstract common features from them all and they're all to do with like truth apt propositions of moral realism, I think is very, very wrong.
Yeah, it's actually worth noting something that's a bit ironic about accusations. Like, I take a pragmatist view about things. A lot of my views would be described as radical or skeptical or revisionary. But I actually think my view of language and human cognition more generally. So I endorse like Sperber and Mercier's argumentative theory of reasoning. I don't think a lot of human argumentation evolved or that were adapted psychologically to be like truth conducive in the way that we go about arguing. I think people are big time confabulators. They're big time rationalizers, and that to a considerable extent, the best account of why people reason and argue more like lawyers than philosophers is because it's useful to do so. That it served us it was like beneficial to our ancestors. Now, I'm not trying to make some claim that this has to be some sort of deeply hardwired thing. This could very well be that we're biologically predisposed to pick up on cultural cues and can readily adapt to like the cultural and social facts around us. And then it turns out being very signally, being very trying to say things to say, hey, I'm part of this group and not of that group, that could be almost entirely learned. So I'm not making some sort of like nativist nature versus nurture type of claim here. Rather, my point here is that it's a question about what we're doing with language and what we're doing with our reasoning processes. And I think they largely function to achieve our goals. So why do people say what they do? Well, people say things, people defend things, people assert things to achieve goals. They have purposes behind them. And when you look at those purposes, that I think is a good place to start when trying to understand how language is working in those contexts. So, in these contexts where people are arguing about morality, I think people are generally trying to get other people to be on board with them, to broadcast what side of an issue that they're on. They have all these functional goals. And it's not so much about, it's almost like philosophers think people are like proposition machines that just go around going, P is true, Q is true, R is true. No one just asserts propositions for no reason. We only ever assert a proposition because we're motivated to do so for some end or purpose. And so I think a better way of approaching language and cognition and reasoning is to look at it as goal-oriented, as functional, and as deeply embedded in the social context of usage in such a way that to eliminate that, to extract moral language from those contexts of usage is to remove moral discourse from the precise functions it actually plays. It plays social functions. Removing it from the social roles it's serving in those contexts, like saying, hey, I'm part of your group, or hey, I don't like those people either, is to remove what is fundamental to what it's actually doing and what it's for. So there is a sense in which, there's more stuff to say here, but more generally, I think that a large part of the way that people actually speak when they talk about things and they talk about what's true or false is actually much more in line, functionally speaking and practically speaking, with the way pragmatists view these sorts of questions. So there's an ironic sense in which I not only deny that my views about these things are generally revisionary, to the extent that my philosophical views could be mapped on to ordinary discourse and ordinary reasoning. I actually think they do a better job descriptively. So I think that philosophers both have a largely invented, constructed, bad system. Like it's bad practically speaking, but it's also bad like descriptively speaking. So I don't think people go around thinking, speaking, or acting like moral realists. I think people go around thinking, speaking, and acting in a way that would be better captured by Sperber Mercier's account, by more recent views about language cognition, like that are like the ones presented in the language game. I think philosophers are wrong about it, things pretty much like root and branch. It's just wrong all over the place.
Yeah.
What do we do if we just have different intuitions? At the end of the day, I don't know. And I believe that in fact there are a lot of anti-realists who are such, because
I find that so frustrating. What do we do if we just have different intuitions at the end of the day? Like, I'm so able to deconstruct my intuitions and question, like, well, where did these intuitions come? Like, even for things where I'll say this seems this way to me, I can reflect on that and go, well, why does it seem that way to me? Like, was I raised in a context where people held these views very strongly? Did I have a teacher who taught this subject and had a particular leaning? Did I read a particular book? Like, I can reflect on those things and sort of deconstruct why, and then think, well, on reflection, is it a good reason for me to think of it that way? Like, I don't just stop at the fact that I'm like, well, that seems that way to, like, I said the sentence that seems that way, so now I can't reflect on what I believe anymore, and I'm just stuck. Like, again, very weird that philosophy, like within philosophy, which is supposed to be the subject that's about carefully interrogating these things, it would be like, what can I do? I just intuit it that way, and now I'm trapped, and we're trapped with this disagreement. Like, that's so like uncritical to me and unthoughtful. But yeah.
Moral realism just strikes them as counterintuitive. Like, yeah, like, and then, it's not just Lance. Like, I met other people who it seems that way. What do you do? I don't know, but it seems like there are more people with realist intuition. But I don't really know what to do if you have a clash of intuitions.
It doesn't seem that way to me. It doesn't seem to me that more people have realist intuitions. I mean, one is like, I wrote my whole dissertation on this. Seems like most people don't have realist intuitions. It looks like if you survey analytic philosophers, a majority of them will respond to the Phil paper survey by saying, yes, they believe in moral realism. But if you look at the breakdown of that, you actually have a slightly more favor naturalist accounts of realism than non-naturalist accounts of realism. Now, you could lump naturalists and non-naturalists together, but in many ways, non-naturalists have greater affinity with anti-realists than they do with realists. They certainly don't have some sort of like Morean sense, or at least if they do, it may or may not serve any significant dialectical role in the way that they formulate their positions. They're just, like, naturalists are just not in the business of doing the same thing as non-naturalists, and actually share many of the non-naturalist objections to naturalism. So to me, that actual scenario looks like a rock, paper, scissors breakdown of very, very different positions. I mean, to the extent that naturalists want to reduce moral claims to descriptive facts, they don't even believe in the kinds of authoritative, irreducible, normative facts non-naturalists do. And if you look at the other question on the Phil paper survey that breaks that survey down further, you get 26.6% of the philosophers responding to the survey endorsing non-naturalism and 26.1% endorsing anti-realism. And so you've got a 0.5% more that favor your position over mine. That's not a big difference.
Well, okay, wait. I mean, naturalism counts as part of realism. Now, so I have objections to naturalism, but I don't think that I have a clash of intuitions with them. Like, I mean, in a way, naturalism is similar to subjectivism. They're both reductionist theories, but the way that people think about it is, the main division is realism versus anti-realism, and naturalism goes on the realist side. And if you took anti-realism and then you broke it down into more specific versions of anti-realism, then you can also get each of those having, like your specific position. You're the only person I know who says that. So you can get smaller percentages. But okay, my disagreement with the naturalist is basically I think that they don't have a good account of the epistemology. They think they do, and I think they're confused. And I think you have to go through some complicated reasoning to see why they're confused. Right? But I think if they accepted those arguments, then they would come over to non-naturalist realism. I think. Yeah,
you might not reject naturalism for the same reasons I do. I tend to be more favorable towards like triviality objections. I think if there were moral facts of the claims the naturalist thinks that there are, I think I would kind of shrug at him in the way that if a non-naturalist is right, that would be something. But if a naturalist is right, okay. Now, I know that doesn't mean that the position isn't true, but typically when I talk about, false. Typically when I talk about realist positions, what I tend to argue for is what I've been calling a realist trilemma. I tend to argue that they're trivial, false, or unintelligible, and I typically just dismiss naturalist accounts as trivial. Whether or not they're true isn't that interesting to me. So we may have different reactions to that sort of scenario. So I do want to address some of the other things you say, though, if that's okay, because you did give a big list, and I feel like if I leave them unaddressed, that could be a problem for both of us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things you said was interesting is that you don't, if I'm understanding it, that you don't think most people have realist intuitions.
Well,
how would you frame that?
They wouldn't directly intuit realism. Like if you tell them, "Hey, there's this thing called moral realism," then you give them like a definition. I don't think they're going to just immediately think that that's obvious. I think you have to reason to it.
Right. Okay. So I totally agree with that. And if I gave the impression that I think that it's like I've somehow shown realism isn't the common sense position, because if you give a definition of people, they're not going to immediately wholeheartedly affirm it, because like they're going to say, well, what is moral realism? What do you mean exactly by an objectionable fact? At least if they're being careful enough or be confident interpreting them. What I'm actually thinking is more that if they could be put in a state of understanding those questions, you're going to face a serious problem. One is that I'm not sure you can actually prompt them to understand the questions adequately to respond to them without them actually having sufficient training, education, or understanding of philosophical problems. And in that case, they're not really members of the population, non-philosophers, or people whose judgments we could consider common sense. So now they've been trained in philosophy. The second problem is that if you then induce them to understand the questions adequately, you run a significant epistemic risk of like this. I'm not saying that they wouldn't necessarily take a position on the matter, but it would be very hard to know whether or not their response was indicative of what they would have thought prior to training, because you could bias them towards a particular view. So, when I ask students in my class, and I think this is pretty common for instructors, I get a bunch of anti-realist students. Like I've had it being unanimous that students favor some type of relativism or anti-realism. I don't immediately just assume they're all anti-realists. I assume a lot of them are not really sure what's at stake there. A lot of times, if you ask them, they'll say like, "Oh, well, I think we need to tolerate other people," or they'll make these descriptive claims. So different people have different values. I'm actually curious if you have a similar experience. That people will give this like superficial anti-realism, but if you start picking at it, it doesn't really look like anti-realism.
No, I think that's right. I think they give a hard time getting the question. So focusing on the question that you want them to focus on, and they'll say these other things about toleration and it's very common to substitute a descriptive issue. Like they think you're asking whether people have different beliefs. No, that's not what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, and this is actually borne out in my data. I ask people open response questions about what they think it means. And a lot of times people will say, "Oh, it means different people have different beliefs," or "It means you should tolerate people with different values." So they tend to give these other sorts of responses. So the issue I have, the issue I have is that I don't think we're in a position to figure out what non-philosophers think about these issues in a way where we could be confident that their judgments aren't simply skewed towards whatever sort of training or education they receive. So there's a good chance that different ways of presenting the corpus of philosophy to people could incline people towards realism or anti-realism. We look at just the state of the field in the 1920s or 30s. My understanding from at least anecdotal reports from philosophers around at the time is that like non-cognitivism is super popular. Most people were anti-realists, and that's changed. And so it could very well be many students in this classes could be inclined towards anti-realism as a result of the teachers skewing the way that they presented things to students. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, anecdotally, my experience is like when I hear from other professors about what most students think, there's a surprising correlation between what most students think and what that professor's own views are. And my explanation is that the students are able to somehow detect what the professor thinks, even though he didn't say it. And then they tell the professor what
Whoa, hang on. Even though he didn't say it, like, I think that the causal explanation would more be that he did sort of say it implicitly in the way that he communicated, the subjects to the students, right? Like, like it's not like he didn't say it and like telepathy is at play or something. It would be that there's some sort of subtle biasing of the way that the arguments get presented, or maybe a particular position is given an unfair due over another or something like that, right? There's going to be some mechanistic, like tangible way that happens in the
I don't think you would disagree with that. Yeah. Like they're picking. I think that it might be that the instructions. So there are a couple things that could happen that we could distinguish. The instructions are somehow biasing people, independent of them picking up on cues about the person's beliefs. So, like, even if you took the exact instructions and you had like ChatGPT read them off to people, they would still bias people. Like, imagine instructions that are like, well, you could be a realist, like a good person, or you could be an anti-realist, like a piece of shit asshole. Which one of those are you? Like the instructions.
You mean like Huemer's opening argument?
Well, I wouldn't frame it that way. But or you could have people somehow know the person's view, and no matter how neutrally they present it, they're like, well, that person is an anti-realist or realist, and so I'm gonna respond accordingly.
Yeah.
They think he wants to hear, and they probably don't have very serious views. Like most of the time, I don't know this philosophy stuff, whatever. I'll say whatever he wants.
Right. I suspect you might be right about that. I thought something kind of similar, that somehow students, I think, at least they're making guesses as to what they think the instructor thinks. And as long as it's more than 50% chance that they're right, that's going to skew the results, at least if it's a dichotomy, in favor of the instructor, like them. Their responses correlating with the instructor position. It is testable. That'd be a cool thing to test, actually, for survey students. Maybe it's something I'll put on the list. The other thing you'd asked about that I do think is worth clarifying is me saying that there's no fact of the matter. There's a few, that was a very, there's several ways of disambiguating that. So I mean actually several things at once. It's really not a good way for me to frame things. The main thing that I would say, and you might even just agree with this, or maybe I don't know, is that when people make moral claims, like in the ordinary sense, so I go out and I find a person saying murder is wrong. I don't think from looking just at that specific instance that it would be, there's going to be two issues. One is that I don't think there's a fact of the matter about whether that person is committed to any specific form of realism or anti-realism. And the second is that at the very least, I think any attempt at trying to understand what they might mean would be underdetermined by the evidence in most cases. Like you just wouldn't be able to actually figure out what that person is trying to say in most of those contexts. So there's that aspect of it, which is that I don't think people have determinate commitments or stances with respect to realist and anti-realist views. I don't think it means they don't mean anything. That'd be a ridiculous claim. Like when people say murder is wrong, they just don't mean anything at all. I think that when we're looking at what people mean, the way I look at meaning is I would say, well, what is the person trying to do? What are they trying to communicate themselves? And then I would cash out what they mean in that context in those terms. And for me, since meaning is determined holistically and it's in its context of usage, I wouldn't throw out the pragmatics with the, as the bathwater of the semantic baby. I think if to the extent that there's even a distinction to make there, you got to bundle it all together. And that a significant part of like pragmatics is not just this like extra stuff on the side. I think it's a big part of what people are doing. So even in a case where a person would, by stipulation, be asserting a proposition like murder is wrong, in any actual context where they're talking, or like say people are arguing about abortion, even if you're a realist arguing for abortion, they're not just trying to like state propositions without a purpose, without a goal. Like a person that's like, look, abortion is wrong. They're trying to persuade other people. And so there are these pragmatic things that sort of latch on to even if it is a propositional claim. And those are coming along for the ride. And they're also expressing those things. And it's a common thing that's worth pointing out to like undergrads. Like a realist is not making the claim that when a person makes a moral claim, that they're only conveying semantic content about the extent of facts. They could also be expressing stuff. It's just that they're not only expressing stuff. And so for me, when we look at what people are what the meaning of ordinary moral claims, we could remove the realist and anti-realist stuff, and then there's whatever else is left over. So they certainly mean things. It's just an empirical question what they mean. Sorry, I said a lot there.
Good. Okay, so yeah, this is coming into focus more. So, as I understand it, so you would respond to my my example of like how it's wrong to torture babies by saying, well, yeah, maybe actually it isn't wrong to torture babies, but the implausibility of that sentence derives from the like pragmatic implications, which are always there, even if you're a realist, and doesn't derive from the whatever the cognitive semantic content. And I guess, and my attempt to get around that is to imagine that you. Yeah.
And do you think Huemer here, when he says cognitive semantic content, that is where he means, moral realism theory being true, right?
I don't know.
Okay.
You have a context in which you neutralize the usual pragmatic implications, right? By just saying no. You're like, and I don't want people to torture babies. Don't torture babies, okay? I don't, because I hate it. But it is not wrong to do it. And then I claim that that's implausible. But then you're going to say that it's not implausible anymore.
Right, that sounds right. Yeah, I would not claim it's implausible. And I would also make the further claim that I don't think, if you could somehow, maybe this is just not demonstrable with current Earth technology. I suspect at least some people that would say in those cases that it's implausible, they're still subject to the pragmatic influences. Like the implications are somehow influencing them. I can't demonstrate that, though. I can't read your mind or anyone else's mind. And you may have considered this position, far more than the vast majority of people. So, if you're saying it's not the pragmatics, fine, take your word for it. But for most people, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if they would favor my side or your side. And so, at the very least, I would be very hesitant to say that the realist position, even under these like special circumstances where we're removing the pragmatic influences and we're extracting the language from those contexts and we're putting it in some special context.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to what the preponderance of people would favor under those conditions, even if we look at the Pill Papers data, because I don't know the facts about the degree to which those people are subject to these sorts of influences.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone else does either. We haven't done that research. Like I don't know how good philosophers are at holding pragmatic influences in abeyance, to what extent and how systematically they are capable of doing so, nor do I know if the extent to which they're capable of doing so is operational when they're answering those questions. Like when they're filling out the Pill Paper survey, are they holding that stuff constant? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. So I would at least push back against the notion that realism is a like, first of all, I certainly don't think most non-philosophers are realists, but even in the cases where one wants to claim it's like the most plausible position by the preponderance of philosophers, I'm skeptical even there.
Yeah. So I wonder if you think axiological judgments go the same way as deontic judgments, and I think this might be worth thinking about because, like, there's some people, like I have a colleague who doesn't believe in obligation. He just believes in good and bad, right? This is Alistair Norcross. So he thinks actions are better or worse than other actions, but there's no obligatoriness. Okay. So, you imagine somebody saying, well, like pain is bad. We could put some qualification, whatever, pro tanto, intrinsically bad. And then, okay, but, obviously I don't like it. So imagine somebody saying, pain isn't bad. I just don't like it. And, does that seem implausible? Or would you say that sounds fine?
Yeah. So this actually goes back to some of the other stuff.
Did you want me to pause it? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a question about like your pain is like. Can you take it back just so I can hear exactly what you said?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay. So you imagine somebody saying, well, like pain is bad. We could put some qualification, whatever, pro tanto, intrinsically bad. And then, okay, but obviously I don't like it. So imagine somebody saying, pain isn't bad. I just don't like it.
Yeah,
And
yeah, so he's going to ask, like, does that say, your pain isn't bad, I just don't like it? Does that sound weird? Well, yeah, it does sound weird. But it sounds weird because of the pragmatics, right?
Yeah,
that's my take on it. Because like if I said to someone, someone's like, oh, I got my wisdom teeth out, it really hurts, and I'm like, your pain isn't bad, but I don't want you to be in pain, but it's not bad. I sound like a callous asshole. But that's because the pragmatic, the impression I'm giving is like, don't be a baby. You're like, I don't care that much. Like you're communicating things that in a social context would make you seem rude and unconcerned about the person's welfare. But and also, if you weren't doing that, why the hell in a regular everyday context would you say something like, well, I don't think that there's pain qualia because I'm an illusionist about consciousness, and so technically you weren't experiencing pain qualia. That would violate other norms, like norms of relevance. So that's not a relevant thing to say to somebody in an actual ordinary social context. And so the colloquial reading, yeah, it would sound weird for the pragmatic reasons. The non-colloquial, technical, philosophical meaning would sound weird because it's not relevant to the social context. So why the hell would anyone say something like that in an actual context, like where someone is in pain? The answer is they probably wouldn't, and it would be weird because it's like a socially inappropriate thing to say, not because there's anything philosophically suspect with the view that would prompt someone to say that in a philosophical context. At a philosophical conference.
Yeah, but even in a philosophical context, I think, that the reason that it seems weird is because, the way that we predominantly use language is in those ordinary contexts, and that's where our intuitions come from, right? Is as speech users in those ordinary contexts. So then we sort of like have, when we say there's an intuition that it's weird or whatever, we do have that feeling that it's weird, but that's being informed by that background knowledge rather than, it being like informed by this deep clash with like realism or something. It might additionally also be weird because of that, but like a lot of the work I think is being done by that background knowledge as well about how language works, and then it's driving us down the road of these philosophical views.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that philosophers just they might think that they can imagine the meaning of these sentences outside their colloquial usage, and I think my prediction is that they just systematically fail to do this. They're not. I mean, I was just saying this in the conversation. I'm very skeptical that philosophers can just suspend these pragmatic associations. Like, just try to get just stipulate a sentence like, hey, I by the following sentence, I just mean 2 + 2 = 4, and then I give them the sentence. It's okay to torture babies all day long. In fact, I love it. It's the greatest thing to do ever. That just means 2 + 2 = 4. And I want you to repeat that sentence and tell me that it's true. They're not going to want to do it. And they're not going to want to do it for a very obvious reason, which is that it's going to sound like they're an evil lunatic. And I'm like, no, but you don't understand. I've stipulated that those.
And even if it wasn't that, if it wasn't that, you could go with like a really like politically incorrect statement about something, and because you just can't remove.
Give me one, please.
Yeah, I'm not going to give you, but I'm just saying, like, because you just can't remove language use from like context completely. Like, language exists in real context, and these are
right. And so people know that they can't say that stuff in a stream or at a conference or in a conversation, because even if you're like, no, but technically what I mean by baby torture,
I'm just making a technical point.
I'm just making a technical. No one is like, some people might be able to go, fine, I understood it was a technical point, but everyone is aware, unless they're like have a catastrophic misunderstanding about human social behavior, that if you're not careful about the implications of what you say, it's going to land you in social trouble. And so people modulate what they say and how they think and how they speak. And I'm serious about the thinking part too. I think people are even afraid to think things that would sound deviant to phrase in a particular way. So like it would sound weird. What is that supposed to show? Like, I'm just not sure what that's supposed to be diagnostic of, other than, people don't want to say things that sound bad in contexts where the pragmatics of it would make them sound like a jerk or stupid or evil or whatever.
Does that seem implausible? Or would you say that sounds fine?
Yeah, so this actually goes back to some of the other stuff you said, but I'll just address this. What I would say about this is, it depends what you mean when you say pain is bad. So, in a lot of cases, it looked like you were telling me that like you just want this intuition about whether the statement is true, not necessarily in the non-naturalist sense, but I don't know how to have an intuition about like an undifferentiating conception of truth. Like it's true in some sense, but we'll leave open what sense in which it's true. The sense in which I would think it's true would be contingent on what it would mean for it to be true, like true in some anti-realist sense or true in some realist sense. So if you unpacked true, like in an anti-realist sense, like some subjectivist sense, like, hey, does it seem to you that torturing babies is wrong, that you disapprove of it? And it's true in the sense that if you were to say it's wrong, you would be saying you disapprove of it. Absolutely, of course, I'd say that's true. But what about in the stance independent sense? Then no. It's the same thing here. It depends what you mean by bad. So if by bad, if you mean bad in some sort of like I don't like this language, but like intrinsic sense, or a sense where it would be bad independent of whether I regarded it as bad, then the answer would be no. The problem is that someone can just stipulate that by what they mean by bad just is a thing that, as a matter of stipulation, is disapproved of by the person experiencing it. And then in that sense, of course, I'd say it seems bad, but then it would be trivial. So, and there might be other interpretations. The problem is that when you take these like normative or evaluative claims and you don't unpack the presuppositions behind them, I can't give a determinant that seems true or that seems false. I need to know what the presupposition.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So this is a good question. Like, can you have intuitions about whether some statements?
One thing that is coming to my mind that I think I want to raise though here is that for everything you've said, it seems like Huemer sort of thinks the points that you're making are fairly reasonable and not crazy. And so this is what I find frustrating about the way he ended his opening statement as well, where he was sort of like, putting your views as like these really implausible, weird philosophical things that no one would believe unless they'd been like corrupted by philosophy or something like that. But then it doesn't seem to actually be like that as you kind of get into the details, right? It seems more like you're then giving reasonable rebuttals, and he kind of signs up to a lot of the things you're saying and thinks that they're good considerations. And so, I think that whole bit was maybe a little bit of an overstatement of maybe even how confident he should be in like how wrong you are or something. But yeah.
True or false, independent of, on account of what it means. So, you might think it might seem plausible that no, you can't, like somebody has to tell you what it means. Then they either give you a realist analysis or an anti-realist analysis, and whichever they do, it makes the intuition useless for making the argument, right? And so I want to say, no, you can have an intuition about whether something is true without specifying the analysis of it. Okay, so, and actually this is important for the conduct of analytic philosophy. This is important for a philosophical method, right? So, like think about the definition of knowledge, and the traditional definition is knowledge is justified true belief or something, and then Gettier comes along and refutes this by giving these examples. And so he didn't give this example, but a better example than Gettier's examples is the stopped clock. So you're looking at a clock, it says 3 o'clock, you justifiably believe that's 3 o'clock. The clock, unbeknownst to you, is stopped. It's a broken clock. This, back when they used to have analog clocks. Okay, okay, but coincidentally, it happens to be stopped at the time that it actually is when you're looking at it. Okay, so did you know what time it is? Okay, so, and then almost everyone intuits that you didn't know that. Okay, and then that refutes the justified true belief analysis of knowledge. Now, imagine somebody saying, well, no, I can't have intuitions about that without you telling me what you mean by no. So if you mean no in the sense of justified true belief, then I intuit that he does know. And if you mean no in the sense of some other analysis, then I intuit that he doesn't know.
So there's a big difference here, which is that in this case, the purpose of a Gettier problem is to see how a person deploys or applies the concept of knowledge. Would you use the term knowledge in this case? So the whole point of the thought experiment is that, hey, we're not actually sure what knowledge is. We're not sure what the conditions are. Would you use it in this case? Would you use it in this case? Is that what's going on when someone says, hey, do you think it's wrong to torture babies for fun? Would you use the term wrong or like, do you think it's true?
Yeah, right.
To use it in this case? Are we intending to conceptually analyze the concept of true?
Yeah, it seems more like that. Yeah. It seems
not the
more
purpose of the
a relevant term. Yeah. I get what you mean.
Yeah, so it seems like in one of these cases, we're doing conceptual analysis, and the other, are we also doing conceptual analysis?
Yeah, it'd be like you or something, yeah.
Yeah, when you're asking me, do I think it's wrong to torture babies for fun? Or do I think the statement it's wrong to torture babies for fun is true? Are you asking me how I would employ the ordinary concept of true, or are you asking me for my own view? Because is that what's happening in the Gettier cases? Are you asking the person for their private view of knowledge? Because then you could respond to a Gettier case by saying, yeah, I'd call that knowledge, whatever. You could call it whatever you want. You could take whatever stance you want on the matter. But in those cases, my understanding is that the purpose was to prompt people to figure out what the actual concept of knowledge is. And as you'll see here, I don't think there is an actual concept of knowledge. So that
Yeah.
strikes me as a nonsensical question. There isn't a solution to get at your problems. And so if that's the kind of question he's trying to ask me in the case of like, is it wrong to torture babies for fun? If that is framed in a specific philosophical context where I'm supposed to give an analysis of truth in the ordinary sense, I'm not sure that these are analogs for it. That's weird. Like, that's not what I'm doing when I'm answering that question. I'm telling you something about my well, I mean, one is the normative entanglement thing, is that I'm dealing with an issue that you've just asked me what seems to be a meta-ethical question. You've embedded it inside a normative question, and now I'm trying to navigate how the heck to answer that question in a way that's not misleading or confusing. But I'm also just telling you something about my own meta-ethical stance. I'm not telling you about the deployment conditions of some shared concept. I'm not doing that. So like when I say things are true, I'm quite literally not even intending to use some specific ordinary concept because I'm a pragmatist. I don't presume that the ordinary concept of true is the pragmatic view of truth. So you would have to clarify here, are you asking a question about what I think the ordinary concept is in ordinary contexts, or are you asking a question where you're trying to like figure out what my theory is, my private personal theory about what my actual position is independent of ordinary usage? But once that's disambiguated, these questions are fairly straightforward to answer.
I think so, but I do think that from Michael's point of view, he kind of gets to have his view of truth and semantics for free. And so your, answer to that question, then he can combine his view of truth and semantics with your answer to just derive, meta-ethical conclusions, right? And I think that is kind of like a little bit uncritical, a bit like cookie cutter, because obviously all of that stuff should be up for grabs as well.
Right. All of those things are potential matters of contention. So it looks like a lot of the questions that are being asked are basically saying, hey, here are the assumptions on the table that we're granting as true. We have granted them as true. Now answer the question within this framework. And it's like, I didn't grant these assumptions as true. I'm not granting them. Well, this is
you
the
could do that, right?
So answer the question.
But if he framed the question that way, then if he said like, look, now let's assume that truth means this, and here's the correct analysis of semantics, and I ask you the question, what do you answer? I mean, maybe you would answer yes, but it doesn't. That doesn't show you that moral realism is true. I mean, it does in that hypothetical example, but it doesn't show you in the actual world that it's true, because it's just if you it's like if you ask the question, imagine that you believe moral realism is true. Do you believe moral realism is true? And it's like, well, yeah, because you specified that in the thought experiment. So
it's strange because a lot of the questions almost seem like conditional on me being right about a bunch of things you don't agree with. Would you say yes or no to this question?
Yeah.
I don't know. Two, who cares? Like what? Yeah. Why does it matter what I would say in some hypothetical circumstance that I don't endorse?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, though, I sort of, even though I view it as like a little bit deviant or whatever, I don't think that Michael's intent is to like be deviant with it. I think it just comes out of like these different metaphilosophical approaches to where he's not like unpacked that aspect of what he's doing here. So yeah, like I don't mean to impart like ill intent or something on it. Like I dislike it, I guess I'd say, or I get a bit like, and so I'm critical of like philosophy done that way, but I don't think it's done out of like malice or something like that as well.
I 100% agree. I didn't get even a whiff of any sort of like intent to say like to
mislead.
He's operating for the presumption of a particular framework. Like to the extent that I feel like I'm rejecting the presumptions, I don't think there was any intent to coerce or anything like that. It's just he has a view about, he has these background views. I don't share those views. We're coming at the question from different metaphilosophical presuppositions. And one thing to say is the approach that he's taking is one that is widely accepted, widely received, and widely utilized in almost every analytic philosophical context in which one would ordinarily be having these discussions. So for someone to enter into that discussion that is rejecting foundational assumptions of the field could be jarring, weird, and difficult to handle readily, even if you're an absolute expert and are super knowledgeable about this standard discourse. The same way it would be if someone was entering some scientific dispute and they weren't accepting certain common methodologies or certain facts. And there's that. And then there's also like, if you're approaching things from that perspective, there might also be this social dynamic that a person that has within those contexts and discourses highly non-standard views, that person may be at certain sorts of disadvantages because humor doesn't do this, but a lot of people outside of conversations with academics will say that I have some sort of obligation to show humility because I have a fringe view, I have a less common view, I have to bow to the authority of my colleagues. That I'm implying, if I'm confident about my views, even though less than 1% of people hold my views, that I think I'm better at thinking than everybody. I don't think that. There's this social dynamic there too. So there's something that makes the conversation difficult, and I'm entering into a discourse on analytic philosophy, and I'm against analytic philosophy. So it's kind of like if I showed up to a theological meeting among Catholics, and I'm not even a Catholic. I'm like, I don't know, some evangelical, and I start arguing with them about theology, and they're like, dude, we're trying to have a conversation for Catholics. Like, what are you doing here? I'm kind of doing that a bit when I'm arguing with analytic philosophers.
Yeah.
And that might not be the kind of conversation they want to have or that they're used to having.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's some like weird faux pas thing about it. But then I think that's part of the criticism, right? Is that the lack of reception to that sort of criticism is then like biasing the discipline in bad direction.
But he is pretty receptive here.
He is, yeah, which is good. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just delighted that I wish there was more engagement, but also I could have engaged in what he said more. I would have wanted there to be more, but this was already a 2-hour conversation. Some people in the comments are like, I wish you would have talked about that. I wish you would have talked about that. I pretty much agree with all of them. I wish you would have talked about A and B and C, but there's like opportunity costs. So
right.
What can you do?
Yeah.
By the way, I am going to have to get going at some point. Are you just going to keep reviewing this without me? I don't know if you want to.
I can do, or I can sort of like skip to. I mean, I've heard that the closing statements were sort of like valuable. I don't know if that.
You don't have to stick around to finish with me. You could just keep reviewing without me.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of need the toilet as well. Like, I don't know. I feel kind of sick. I don't know if I got food poisoning or something.
Well, you're hosting an anti-realist, so maybe it's karmic punishment.
Yeah, that's it. Maybe how long are you thinking you've got, Lance?
Oh, I wanted to get going like in a couple minutes. I should really.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, yeah, if you want to go, and then maybe I'll end this and continue reviewing at some other point, or we can do another part 2 or something. I don't mind.
I'd be happy to do part 2. I'm getting increasingly anxious with the amount of other things that I need to get.
No worries. Well, we can call it there then for part 1 at least.
Yes, it's almost exactly halfway. So
yeah, awesome. Right, Len's running away.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, just a bit because he's about to level a withering critique of your views in the second half.
It's freely available on. So you could just go watch him level the critique right after this.
Yeah, no worries. Right, well, thanks, Lance, for that, and then we'll set up doing a part 2 at some point. Obviously, people on my channel go over to Lance and also whatever the guy's Curiosity was called, and if you want to see more of these discussions and leave comments and likes and things to boost engagement on this stuff as well if you want to see more. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Yep, hope you feel better.
Yeah, cheers.